Oh, it seems I have a visitor this evening. Welcome. The sky hangs clear and quiet tonight, the traveler watching silent over the city below, and I know you've come to rest beneath it. Take things slowly, and all will be well. I have some stories to share, ones that you may like. Are you all settled for this night? Good. Tonight, we drift far from this city, out past the rings of Saturn, to a drowned and dying gas giant called Fundament. There a small creature was born, who would one day become a god, a king, and the master of the Taken. Before the wings, before the throne, before the darkness spoke his name, he was only a curious daughter of a doomed king. This is the complete story of Oryx. Far beyond the reach of any guardian's patrol, past the cold rings of Saturn, there turned a vast gas giant called Fundament. It was a world much like Jupiter, wrapped in endless bands of storm and cloud, swollen with poison and pressure. Somewhere in its middle depths floated great continents, and these continents were the broken shards of an older world that had shattered long ago and drifted down into the churning atmosphere. Upon these floating fragments of rock and dust, life clung and struggled and multiplied. It was a strange place to build a civilization, yet civilizations rose there all the same, small and desperate and brief. The creatures who lived upon those continents were called the Krill, and they were the ancestors of the hive. They were small things, soft and pale, with short lives that rarely stretched beyond 10 years. 10 years was the whole span of a krill existence, from birth to the slow madness that took the old, and so their history moved quickly, generation piling upon generation like snow. They fought one another for scraps of the floating land, for salvage, for the right to rule a court. Their kings warred and schemed and died young, and the sea below them waited to swallow anyone who fell from the edge. The world itself hunted them. Above the continents drifted the storm joys, living clouds that trailed long feeding tentacles and dangled false stars of light to lure the curious upward, and any krill who chased that light would be seized and drawn into the cloud and consumed. The rain that fell was often poisonous, hissing against the rock. The wind could tear a body loose and cast it down into the depths, where the pressure grew and grew until nothing could survive it. To live on Fundament was to live at the mercy of a world that offered no mercy, and the krill knew this in their bones from the moment they hatched. Upon one of these floating continents stood the Osmium court, and it was ruled by a king known simply as the Osmium King. He was old for his kind, and he had sired many broods across his long reign, and among the last of his children were 3 sisters born of the same clutch. The eldest of the 3 was named Oryx. She was female then, as all her kind began, curious beyond the measure of her sisters, drawn always toward the questions that others feared to ask. She wanted to know how the world worked, why the moons moved as they did, what lay beneath the sea and beyond the clouds. Where others saw only danger, Oryx saw mystery, and mystery pulled at her like a tide. The second sister was named Sathona. She was the cunning one, quick to see the angle in a thing, quick to find the lie beneath a smile and the weakness beneath a boast. Where Oryx reached toward the horizon, Sathona watched the ground close at hand, and she trusted little and questioned everything. She loved her elder sister and followed her thinking, yet she carried her own sharpness, always ready beneath her patience. The third and youngest was She-Ro. She was the fierce one, bold and quick to anger, and quicker still to laugh. The sister who threw herself at every challenge with her whole body. She wanted to prove herself, to test her strength against the world, to matter through action rather than thought. Between the three of them, there was a bond forged in the closeness of the clutch, a loyalty that held even when their natures pulled them in different directions. Together, the three sisters were the final brood of the Osmium king, born into a court that was already old and a father who was already fading. They played along the edges of the floating continent. They listened to the songs and warnings of their people, and they grew as all krill grew, swiftly and under the constant shadow of the sea. They did not yet know that their father's mind was beginning to slip, that his long life was curdling into terror, and that the fear taking root inside him would soon set all three of them upon a road from which none of them would ever return. When the Osmium king reached 10 years of age, his mind began to fray, and the madness that claimed all old krill settled into his brain. He confined himself to the highest rooms of the Osmium court, pacing the cold stone floors and muttering to himself while his three daughters listened at the door. He had ruled the continent for his entire adult life, holding it against the helium drinkers and the other rival courts, but now his thoughts turned entirely toward the sky. Fundament had 52 moons, large bodies of rock and ice that pulled at the heavy atmosphere and the deep oceans. The king tracked their orbits with trembling hands, drawing charts across the walls and calculating their paths over and over again. He saw something in those paths that terrified him, a convergence that he called the syzygy. He believed that all 52 moons were moving into alignment and that when they finally stacked one behind the other, their combined gravity would reach down into the world's oceans. This pull would lift a bulge of water so massive that it would become a god wave, a wall of the sea tall enough to wash over the floating continents and drown every living thing upon them. Urash spent hours listening to her father's ravings, trying to understand his charts. She absorbed his terror and his certainty, and she began to look up at the moons with the same fearful calculation. Sathona and Shiro also heard the warnings, but they worried more for their father's immediate weakness than for a wave that might never come. They knew that a weak king invited challenges, and that the Osmium court could not survive if its ruler spent his final days screaming at the sky. Their fears were shared by Taox, the king's oldest counselor and the teacher to his daughters. Taox was a sterile mother, a morph of the krill that lived much longer than the standard 10 years, tasked with raising the broods and advising the rulers. She watched the king's mind crumble and saw the danger clearly. The rival helium court, ruled by creatures who drank the buoyant gas of the atmosphere and sometimes ate their own kind, was waiting for any sign of weakness. Taox looked at the three young princesses, only 2 years old, and saw children who were too soft, too curious, and too divided to hold the court together once their father died. In the quiet hours, Taox made her calculations. She concluded that the Osmium court would fall if the king remained in power, and that his heirs would only lead their people into ruin. She saw the king's obsession with the syzygy as a fatal distraction from the real threat of their neighbors. And so Taox made a choice to save her home, a choice that would break the court apart and set the three sisters on their long, dark path. Taox gathered the wide, fibrous leaves from the creeping plants along the courtyard walls, snapping their thick stems with her hands. She etched her proposal into the pale green surface with a sharpened bone stylus, pressing deep enough to leave dark sap pooling in the grooves. Rolling the leaves tightly, she sealed them inside a buoyant membrane harvested from a gas bladder beast, tying the ends with dried sinew. She carried the package to the edge of the floating continent, standing over the sheer drop, and released it into the violent updrafts. The winds carried the package across the vast gulf of the sky toward the neighboring fragment of rock known as the helium court. The helium drinkers lived there, breathing the pockets of noxious gas rising from the lower atmosphere. They sustained themselves by consuming the flesh of other krill, cracking the shells and bones of the weak to suck out the marrow. Teox offered these creatures a clear path into the heart of the osmium court. Her etched maps detailed the patrol routes of the royal guards, the shifts of the watchmen, and the exact location of the king's upper chambers. In exchange for the deaths of the king and his 3 daughters, Teox asked the invaders to install her as the regent over the surviving populace. The helium drinkers descended upon the osmium court hours later, dropping from the thick, grey storm clouds. They rode massive, leathery flying beasts that glided silently through the heavy rain, landing on the stone parapets with a heavy thud. The warriors dismounted, carrying heavy cleavers chipped from volcanic glass. They wore armor crafted from the heavy carapaces of deep-sea crustaceans, glistening with moisture. They marched through the corridors, smashing the wooden doors into splinters and plunging their blades into the loyal guards. Blood pooled on the flagstones, mixing with the corrosive rain blowing through the shattered window panes. The smell of copper and sulfur filled the winding halls. The helium drinkers ripped flesh from the fallen osmium guards, chewing the meat raw as they marched up the spiral stairs. They breathed heavily, exhaling pale fumes of the noxious gases they consumed. The armored invaders reached the highest tower, kicking open the iron-bound doors to the king's sanctuary. They dragged the old, muttering king to the cold stone floor and severed his head with a single swing of a glass cleaver. Oryx, Sathona, and Shiro heard the crash of breaking wood and the heavy boots echoing up the spiral stairs. The 3 two-year-old sisters scrambled toward the narrow, arched window. Oryx grabbed the damp vines growing along the exterior wall, pulling her body through the opening. Sathona followed, clutching a small, dead white worm she had taken from their father's observation table. Shiro brought up the rear, climbing out just as the heavy wooden door splintered inward. A helium warrior lunged to the window, reaching a clawed hand toward the youngest sister. Shiro swung her foot, driving her heel into the warrior's jaw, sending him stumbling back into the room. The sisters climbed down the rough stone exterior, their fingers finding holds in the cracks and moss. They scrambled across the slick slate roofs, sliding on the wet stone, keeping low to the surface, dodging the flying beasts circling above. They moved swiftly toward the docking spires protruding from the lower edge of the continent. A small wooden skiff sat moored to the pier, swaying violently in the gale. The hull was built from the ribs of a sea beast, wrapped in cured hide and sealed with black pitch. Shiro drew a small dagger she had taken from the armory and sawed through the thick mooring ropes. The hemp fibers snapped, and the boat lurched outward. Oryx and Sathona dropped into the hollow of the hull, and Shiro jumped in right behind them. The rain pelted their faces, stinging their pale skin as they worked the rigging. Sathona tied off the halyard, securing the sail against the violent gusts, while Shiro braced herself at the bow, watching for the trailing tentacles of the stormjoys overhead. Oryx grabbed the heavy wooden tiller, pushing it hard to the side. The wind immediately filled the triangular sail, driving the small ship out into the open sky, leaving the burning rock of their home behind. Oryx looked back over the stern. The banners of the helium court spilled over the high tower, flapping violently in the wind. Teox stood on the balcony beside the armored warriors, watching the small boat drift away. Oryx gripped the tiller, her knuckles white against the dark wood. She swore a blood oath to return, to plunge a blade into Taox, and to retake her home. Sathona and Shiro pressed their hands over Oryx's, adding their voices to the howling wind, repeating the exact words of the vow. Oryx held tightly to the charts her father had drawn of the 52 moons, the rolled parchment tucked safely inside her tunic. She steered the skiff down toward the churning surface of the ocean, chasing the source of her father's final warnings. She sought the origin of the changing tides, the truth behind the shifting moons. The sisters sailed across the endless, storm-tossed expanse of the Fundament Sea, scanning the massive whirlpools ahead. Deep inside the swirling vortexes, ancient metallic wrecks circled in the crushing currents, offering their technological secrets to the bold. For a full year, the small wooden skiff moved across the vast oceans of Fundament. The corrosive rain stripped the black pitch from the hull, exposing the pale bonewood beneath. Salt crusted on the frayed edges of the rigging, and the sisters developed thick calluses on their palms from pulling the wet hemp ropes. They survived by scraping pale algae from the undersides of passing debris and catching blind, translucent fish that swam near the surface. As they reached 3 years of age, their bodies grew taller and their carapaces hardened. The days blurred into a continuous cycle of maintaining the sail, bailing out the pooling water, and charting the movement of the 52 moons above them. Their navigation brought them to the edge of the Shvubi maelstrom. Here, the ocean currents collided and spun into a massive, descending vortex. The water churned and foamed, pulling floating land masses and debris down into the dark center. Caught in the outer rings of the whirlpool was a vessel unlike anything the sisters had ever seen. It was a long, tapered structure of smooth, dark metal, reflecting the flashes of lightning from the clouds above. The hull resisted the acid rain, showing no signs of rust or decay. The 3 sisters tied thick vines to their waists and secured themselves to the skiff, swimming out into the pulling current to board the metallic craft. They pulled themselves onto the slick surface and pried open a heavy hatch. Inside, the corridors were lined with crystalline panels and dormant machinery. The air smelled of old dust and dry ozone. As they explored the chambers, Oryx found a navigation room filled with engraved metallic plates. She traced her fingers over the grooves. The etchings displayed images of their own species, the krill, living on a solid world far above the heavy clouds of Fundament. The diagrams showed ships falling from the sky, crashing into the gas giants' floating continents. The sisters looked at the plates and saw the trajectory of their ancestors. Every species on the floating continents had come from somewhere else in the cosmos. They were all immigrants hiding in the crushing atmosphere of the gas giant. Oryx named the long metallic ship the Needle. The craft contained powerful engines and a heavily reinforced hull, designed for surviving extreme pressures. Shiro walked through the ship's armory and picked up the discarded heavy metallic tools. She pointed her blade toward the horizon, specifically in the direction of the Kahan Atoll. The atoll was a massive, stable landmass where different species traded salvaged goods and weapons. Shiro wanted to sail the Needle there, strip the crystalline panels, and trade them to the mercenary bands. With a hired army, she planned to march back to the osmium court and drive her blade through Taox and the helium drinkers. Oryx stood by the central control console and shook her head. She gripped the metal steering columns and pointed down toward the glass floor panels, showing the dark water below. She wanted to dive the Needle deep into the core of Fundament. She intended to find the gravitational anomaly causing the syzygy, to understand the massive wave that their father had predicted. Sathona walked between her two sisters and placed her hand on Orash's shoulder. She supported the elder sister's plan to dive. Sathona pulled a small object from a pouch at her waist. It was a segmented, pale worm, the size of her palm. It was the familiar creature her father had kept on his observation table. Sathona had carried it since the day they fled the Osmium court. The creature appeared lifeless, completely still, and cold to the touch. Yet, Sathona frequently held the pale body close to her ear. She heard whispers radiating from the dead flesh. The voice instructed her, directing her attention to the deep water, pushing her to seek out the secrets hidden beneath the floating continents. Sathona looked at the rough, scarred skin on her hands and the visible growth rings on her sister's carapaces. They were already 3 years old. Their biology dictated a maximum lifespan of 10 years. In 7 years, their bodies would fail and their minds would succumb to senility. Teox, as a mother morph, possessed a lifespan extending for centuries. Teox would sit on the throne of the Osmium court, outliving the 3 sisters by generations. The math of their existence offered only death in exile. Sathona explained this strict timeline to Shiro and Oryx, her voice echoing off the cold metal walls. She told them that the only solution to their short lives waited at the bottom of the ocean, exactly where the dead worm instructed them to go. Shiro lowered her scavenged weapon and nodded in agreement. Oryx engaged the heavy metallic levers on the control console. The thick outer hatches slid shut, sealing the 3 sisters inside the reinforced cabin. The hum of the ancient engines vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the dust from the ceiling. The needle tipped its pointed bow downward, slipping beneath the turbulent surface of the Shvubi maelstrom. The light of the 52 moons faded above them as the ship descended into the crushing, lightless depths, moving straight toward the absolute center of the world. The metallic bow of the needle angled toward the center of fundament, and the thick waters of the Shvubi maelstrom rushed past the viewport in a torrent of green and black fluid. Oryx pushed the heavy control levers forward, and the ancient engines engaged with a low, vibrating hum that rattled the crystalline panels along the walls. The ship descended through the swirling vortex, moving past the chaotic surface storms and pressing deeper into the ocean. A massive shape emerged from the dark water ahead, blocking their downward trajectory. It was a creature of immense size, wider than the floating continents they had previously lived upon. Thick, segmented armor plates covered its long, undulating body. A bioluminescent organ hung from its broad forehead, casting a stark white glow over the front of the needle. Electricity arced across the creature's broad fins, and consequently, the monitors inside the ship flared with static. The creature broadcast a message directly through the ship's internal audio systems, vibrating the metal floorboards under the sisters' feet. It instructed the sisters to turn the ship around. It stated that the deep water held ruin and destruction, advising them to choose the path of the sky for a peaceful existence above the waves. Sathona stood by the glass floor panels, holding the pale, segmented worm tightly against her chest. The dead flesh whispered against her ear, and she immediately relayed the worm's instructions to her sisters. She pointed at the glowing creature and yelled over the static of the speakers, declaring the massive entity a jailer placed there to keep them away from the truth. Oryx gripped the steering columns and locked her eyes on the depth gauges. She pushed the thruster controls to their maximum limit. The needle accelerated, diving tightly past the massive glowing creature and plunging into the pitch-black water below. The light from the surface vanished entirely, and the water pressing against the ship's exterior turned into a solid wall of black fluid. The needle's exterior hull bent inward slightly, and emitted low, metallic scraping sounds under the accumulating weight of the ocean. Condensation formed on the inner bulkheads, dripping down the metallic walls and pooling on the grated floor. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted rapidly. Frost crystallized on the edges of the navigation console, and the sister's breath plumed in the cold air. Shiro rubbed her arms and paced the length of the narrow corridor, keeping her hand on the hilt of her scavenged blade. She watched the metal seams of the hull as tiny beads of water forced their way through the microscopic gaps in the seals, dripping onto the control panels. Oryx monitored the pressure dials constantly. The metallic needles crept toward the red warning zones, vibrating as the external pressure mounted. The engines burned fuel rapidly to push the heavy ship down through the increasingly dense ocean. The water outside grew thick, presenting the consistency of heavy sludge. Occasional flashes of bioluminescence illuminated the viewport as blind, deep-sea predators darted away from the descending ship. The sisters took turns resting on the cold floor panels, wrapping themselves in torn fabric from the ship's storage lockers. They ate the dried algae rations in silence, chewing the tough fibers, while the hum of the engines and the creaking of the compressed hull echoed through the cabin. The descent continued for several days. The internal air pressure systems of the Needle adjusted to compensate for the external weight, causing the sisters' hardened carapaces to crack and shift. The water pressure outside reached a point where the carbon and heavy elements in the ocean began to crystallize. Sharp, jagged fragments of compressed diamond scraped against the hull, leaving deep scratches in the dark metal. The ship vibrated violently as it pushed through this dense layer of falling sediment. Sathona remained near the viewport throughout the shaking, holding the pale worm close to her face. The whispers grew louder, vibrating visibly through her hands and driving her focus downward. Eventually, the water below the ship began to emit a faint, sickly green glow. Oryx pulled back on the levers, slowing their descent as the Needle broke through the layer of diamond sediment. The ship entered a vast, open cavern near the planetary core. The fluid here was heavy, warm, and highly volatile. Plumes of superheated gas erupted from hydrothermal vents on the rocky seafloor, sending streams of bubbles upward. The interior of the ship warmed rapidly, melting the frost on the consoles and leaving small puddles of water on the floorboards. The thick green light illuminated the jagged landscape of the ocean bottom, revealing deep trenches and towering rock formations. Shiro stepped up to the viewport and pointed toward the center of the largest trench. 5 colossal shapes rested on the seabed. They were long, segmented entities, completely dwarfing the Needle in size. Their thick bodies coiled around the jagged rock formations, overlapping each other in the deep water. Heavy, bone-like plates covered their backs, interlocking like heavy armor. Their broad heads consisted of smooth, unbroken bone plates, ending in massive, multi-hinged jaws, lined with rows of serrated teeth. The green light pulsed directly from the deep fissures in their armor, illuminating the surrounding trench. Oryx steered the Needle toward the largest of the 5 figures, bringing the ship to a hover just above the rocky floor, placing the 3 sisters directly in front of the massive entities waiting in the core. Oryx held the thick control levers, keeping the Needle steady in the turbulent water above the ocean floor. The 5 colossal shapes uncoiled from the jagged rock formations, sending clouds of black silt billowing into the green light of the thermal vents. The water boiled around the edges of their massive, multi-hinged jaws. The largest of the 5 entities pushed its blunt, armored head toward the Needle's viewport. The creature's eye was a solid dome of milky white tissue, wider than the entire hull of the ship. Thick ridges of bone protected its face, and a dense layer of slime coated the dark green segments of its long body. The creature communicated by sending low-frequency vibrations through the water, striking the ship's hull and transferring directly into the metal floorboards. The vibrations traveled up through the soles of the sisters' feet, translating into clear, physical pressure within their auditory organs. The largest entity identified itself as Yul, the honest worm. It named the other 4 coiled figures resting in the trench: Akka, Ea, Sol, and Ur. Yul explained that the 5 of them had rested at the core of Fundament for millions of years. The glowing creature the sisters had bypassed in the water above was the Leviathan, a warden placed there by the agents of the sky to trap the worms beneath the heavy ocean. Yul described the deep, a physical force residing beneath the rock and the water, a force that shaped the universe through the constant friction of survival, stripping away weak matter and leaving only the sharpest, most durable forms. Yul directed his milky eye toward the 3 small krill inside the ship. The vibrations in the floorboards intensified, shaking the dirt from the grooved treads of the metal deck. Yul detailed the failing biology of the 3 sisters, pointing out the brittle edges of their carapaces and the short duration of their 10-year life cycle. He also spoke of the God wave, the syzygy that their father had predicted. Yul confirmed the massive tidal bulge forming on the surface above, driven by the alignment of the 52 moons. The water would rise, the floating continents would submerge, and the krill species would drown in the toxic rain. Yul offered a physical pact to ensure their survival. He unhinged his massive jaws, exposing rows of teeth the size of the floating osmium court. From the dark cavity of his throat, thousands of small, pale larvae spilled out into the warm, green-lit water. The larvae wriggled and twisted, covered in a translucent mucus, and drifted in the current toward the needle's external airlock hatch. Yul instructed the sisters to take the larvae into their bodies. He promised that the larvae would secrete chemicals into their bloodstreams, hardening their weak flesh, repairing their decaying cells, and extending their lifespans indefinitely. The larvae would also grant them direct access to the physics-altering power of the deep, giving them the strength to retake their continent and conquer the species living on the surface. Yul then laid out the strict biological conditions of this symbiosis. The larvae required constant chemical sustenance to survive, and this sustenance could only be generated if the host continuously obeyed her fundamental nature. Yul looked at Shiro. He stated that she must forever test her strength against the environment and her enemies. If she ever retreated from a fight or failed to exercise her physical dominance, the larva inside her would consume her internal organs. Yul turned his massive head towards Sathona. He mandated that she must constantly employ cunning, deception, and strategic manipulation. If she ever acted transparently or abandoned her schemes, the worm would devour her brain and tissue. Finally, Yul addressed Oryx. He commanded that she must forever explore, inquire, and seek to understand the unknown. If she ever ceased her questioning or stopped moving toward new horizons, the worm would eat her from the inside out. As long as they fed the worms through their actions, the worms would grant them unlimited power, and the worms would grow inside them, requiring ever larger acts of violence, cunning, and discovery to remain sated. Shiro gripped her scavenged blade, staring at the small, pale creatures bumping against the thick glass of the viewport. Sathona held the dead worm in her hands, comparing its segmented body to the living ones swarming the ship. Oryx looked at her sisters, seeing the stress fractures in their thin armor and the visible toll of their long journey. They had 3 years left to live, and the surface offered only a drowned world and the blades of the helium drinkers. Arash stepped away from the main console and walked to the manual override wheel of the external airlock. She spun the heavy metal wheel. The heavy metal hinges shrieked as the outer hatch opened, allowing a surge of heavy, warm water to flood into the small decompression chamber, along with dozens of the writhing larvae. Arash sealed the outer door and opened the inner hatch. The water spilled onto the floorboards, washing the pale, mucus-covered worms across the metal grates. Arash knelt, picked up one of the thick, pulsing larvae, and swallowed it whole. Sathona and Shiro followed her exact movements, lifting the segmented creatures from the water and forcing them down their throats. The biological reaction started immediately. Thick, dark fluid seeped from the pores of the sisters' skin, mixing with the water on the floor. Green light flared deep within their abdomens, visible through the gaps in their carapaces. The larvae burrowed into their digestive tracts, fusing with their nervous systems. Arash fell to her knees as her bones elongated, producing loud, snapping cracks that echoed off the cabin walls. Shiro's muscles swelled, tearing her old exoskeleton into jagged pieces that clattered onto the metal deck. Sathona's skull expanded, shifting the plates of her face. They shed their old, brittle forms right there in the pooling water, their new bodies stretching and hardening as the raw, physical power of the deep flooded through their veins. The transformation warped their biology completely, preparing them to break the surface of the water and impose their new shapes upon the universe. The dark fluid, generated by the larvae, mixed with the warm water inside the needle's decompression chamber. Arash stood up from the metal grates. Her exoskeleton expanded, splitting the old joints as new, thick layers of calcified plating formed over her chest and shoulders. Her biological structure shifted entirely, adopting the heavy, dense physiology of the king morph. Her vocal cords lengthened and thickened inside her throat. She opened her jaw and spoke with a deep, resonating pitch that vibrated the glass of the viewport. She announced her new name to her sisters, speaking the word Oryx. The name meant long thought in the language of their court. Oryx was now biologically male, bearing the broad crest and towering height of a ruler, driven by the worm inside his gut to constantly seek out and dissect the mechanics of the universe. Beside him, Sathona gripped the control console as her own skull elongated. The cranial plates shifted outward, making room for rapidly expanding neural tissue. Her eyes grew large and luminous, capturing the faint green light from the ocean floor. She consumed the power of the deep and took the name Savathun. Shiro experienced rapid muscular hypertrophy. Her muscles swelled instantly, snapping the last remnants of her original shell. Heavy, interlocking armor plates fused over her limbs, creating a massive, broad-shouldered frame built for raw kinetic impact. She lifted her scavenged metal blade with a single hand, easily swinging the heavy weapon through the damp air. She claimed the name Shivu Arath. The worms writhed inside their abdomens, secreting chemicals that fueled these immense physical alterations. Oryx grabbed the navigation levers on the central console. He pulled them backward, redirecting the thrusters toward the surface. The ancient engines engaged, and the needle pushed upward through the heavy ocean. The water outside transitioned from the warm, glowing green of the planetary core to the pitch black of the crushing depths, and finally to the gray, turbulent currents near the surface. The needle broke through the crest of a massive wave, exposing the dark metal hull to the corrosive rain and the violent downdrafts of fundament. Oryx steered the ship toward the Kahan Atoll, a wide span of interconnected debris where different species of the floating continents traded physical goods. They docked the needle against the jagged coastal rocks. Oryx, Savathun, and Sivu Arath marched up the shoreline, carrying the remaining pale larvae they had gathered from the deep trenches. They approached the shivering, short-lived krill clustered in the coastal camps. Oryx grabbed the krill and forced the worms down their throats. Savathun and Sivu Arath sliced open the abdomens of the others, inserting the writhing larvae directly into their flesh. The krill convulsed on the wet stone. Their bodies cracked and stretched, shedding their brittle shells in pools of dark fluid. They grew taller, their muscles hardening, their eyes glowing with the green energy of the deep. These newly transformed creatures picked up crude weapons from the dirt. They formed the first ranks of a completely new species, organizing themselves into combat broods. They became the Hive. With an army of plated, heavy-limbed hive behind them, the three gods marched upon the osmium court and the helium drinkers who had occupied it. They crossed the floating land masses, driving their forces straight into the armored ranks of the invaders. Sivu Arath led the vanguard. The heavy glass cleavers of the helium drinkers shattered against her dense armor. She swung her blade, cutting through their deep-sea crustacean plating and severing their limbs. Savathun directed the flanks, positioning her warriors to strike the helium forces against the sheer cliffs and drive them into the sea. Oryx walked through the center of the battlefield, channeling the dark, volatile energy of the deep through his hands, reducing the enemy warriors to ash and cracked bone. Tauok stood on the high balcony of the osmium court, watching the slaughter below. She saw the massive forms of her former pupils tearing through the helium drinkers, their blades covered in thick gore. Teox turned and ran down the spiral stone stairs. She gathered her navigation charts and rushed to the far side of the continent. She boarded a heavy transport ship, severing the mooring lines with a sharp bone knife. She ignited the thrusters, driving the ship away from the floating landmass and disappearing into the dense grey storm clouds. Oryx stood on the parapet, watching the exhaust trail fade into the fog. His grip tightened on the hilt of his sword. The hive spread across the floating fragments of the world, building towering spires from crushed bone and forging new weapons from deep-sea metals. They slaughtered the remaining rival courts, feeding the biological imperatives of the larvae inside their guts. Oryx noticed a constant gnawing sensation in his own stomach. The worm secreted corrosive acid into his stomach lining when deprived of continuous violence, conquest, and physical discovery. Oryx looked at the blood on his blade and the piles of shattered armor across the courtyard. He understood that this localized conquest would fail to sustain the parasite inside him. He needed to structure the entire universe around the physical act of cutting, prompting him to study the mechanics of death and to slice open the spatial fabric separating the physical world from the dimensions beyond. Oryx held his heavy cleaver and struck the fabric of the air. He dragged the jagged edge through the empty space, separating the physical atmosphere from the dimension hidden underneath. A tear opened in the courtyard of the osmium court, leaking pale, cold light across the stone floor. He stepped through the fissure, leaving the heavy gravity of fundament behind. Inside the fissure, the environment consisted of blank, malleable matter. The air carried the scent of ozone and crushed rock. Oryx pressed his hands against the raw material and pushed. He swung his blade, cutting away the soft, yielding pockets of space, leaving only the hard, unyielding geometry behind. He built a structure out of sheer kinetic force. He enacted the sword logic, establishing a physical law dictating that existence belonged exclusively to those who could defend it with violence. He demonstrated this law by striking down a group of hive knights who followed him into the tear. He drove his cleaver through their dense armor, splitting their carapaces and spilling their dark fluids across the ground. His blade overwhelmed the knights' defenses and severed their limbs, physically removing them from the space. As the knights fell, the area around Oryx expanded. The walls of this new realm hardened into jagged obsidian. He carved a massive chair from the compressed dark matter, placing it at the center of this dimension. This space became his throne world, an ascendant realm constructed entirely from the mechanics of death. Savathun and Xivu Arath followed the trail of cold light and stepped through the dimensional tear. They looked at the expanding throne world and immediately drew their weapons. For the next 20,000 years, the three siblings waged a constant, physical war against one another across the floating landmasses of Fundament and within the dark tiers of the sword space. Savathun hid poisoned traps in Oryx's daily rations of dried algae and slipped corrosive gas into his sleeping chambers. She drove a bone dagger through his ribs while he inspected his navigation charts, twisting the blade to sever his spinal column. Xivu Arath commanded her legions to ambush Oryx in the open courtyards. She charged through the ranks of his guards, swinging a massive warhammer and crushing his skull against the flagstones. Oryx retaliated by burying his cleaver into Xivu Arath's chest and snapping Savathun's neck with his bare hands. The blood of the three gods soaked into the soil of Fundament, corroding the rock and leaving deep, toxic craters across the landscape. Each time one of the siblings died in the physical world of Fundament, their consciousness snapped back to their respective throne worlds in the Ascendant Realm. Their physical bodies reformed from the dark matter of their sword spaces, pulling the raw elements together to rebuild bone, muscle, and tissue. They walked back through the dimensional tears, returning to the physical universe to fight again. They used these endless murders to expose the physical flaws in each other's armor, the gaps in their patrol routes, and the slow reaction times in their muscle fibers. Oryx learned to deflect Xivu Arath's hammer strikes by observing the exact angle of her shoulders before she swung. Savathun mapped the blind spots in Oryx's vision every time she slipped a blade into his neck. They hardened their tactics through constant, repetitive slaughter, reshaping their bodies to eliminate the weaknesses that caused their previous deaths. The physical power granted by the worms increased with every kill. Oryx grew larger, his carapace thickening into dense, impenetrable layers of bone. He sprouted massive wings from his back, covered in tough, leathery membranes. Xivu Arath swung her weapons with enough force to shatter the floating continents, her muscles bulging against her spiked armor. Savathun calculated the movement of entirely new star systems, her elongated skull housing an ever-expanding neural network. The three gods carved their way across the moons of Fundament, leaving trails of shattered rock and slaughtered species in their wake. As their bodies and minds expanded, the pale worms inside their abdomens grew wider and longer. The parasites stretched against their internal organs, their segmented bodies shifting visibly beneath the hive god's exterior plating. The worms demanded larger intakes of violent energy to sustain their massive size. Oryx sat on his dark matter throne, clutching his stomach as the corrosive acid burned through his digestive tract. The localized war between the siblings, even stretched over 20,000 years, failed to generate enough death to satisfy the massive parasites. The worms began to bite into the soft tissue of their hosts' intestines, releasing toxins into their bloodstreams. Oryx watched the green light pulsing erratically through the cracks in Savathun's and Xivu Arath's armor. He noted the pained twitches in their limbs and the labored sound of their breathing. The physical strength they had gained from the deep came with an equally massive appetite. The parasites required a constant stream of destruction, and the siblings' continuous resurrections in the ascendant realm yielded diminishing returns for the worm's hunger. The parasites would soon digest their hosts entirely. Oryx gripped the hilt of his cleaver, feeling the sharp pain radiating from his gut. He realized he needed to formulate a plan to extract the maximum amount of power from his sisters in a single permanent strike, preparing to take their strengths and use them to confront the architects of the deep directly. Oryx stood on the obsidian floor of his throne world. The heavy atmosphere pressed down on his broad shoulders, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and scorched copper. He gripped the heavy, bone-wrapped hilt of his cleaver. Savathun and Xivu Arath stood across the dark chamber, holding their own jagged weapons. Xivu Arath wielded a massive hammer forged from compressed planetary rock, while Savathun carried a thin, serrated dagger carved from the tooth of a deep-sea beast. Oryx raised his blade and stepped forward, driving his heavy foot into the stone. He swung the massive metal edge directly at Xivu Arath's neck. The thick iron sliced through her heavy crustacean plating and severed her spinal column. Dark green fluid sprayed across the black floorboards. Xivu Arath collapsed, dropping her heavy warhammer with a loud metallic clang. Savathun reacted instantly, lunging forward with her bone dagger. Oryx dropped his cleaver and caught her wrist. He drove his plated fist directly into her elongated skull. The bone plates cracked inward under the massive kinetic force, and she fell beside her sister. Dark, volatile energy rose from their shattered carapaces. Oryx inhaled the thick fumes, pulling the raw physical material into his own lungs. His muscle fibers swelled, incorporating Xivu Arath's dense muscular structure. His cranial plates shifted and expanded, absorbing the vast neural processing power of Savathun. He gathered their accumulated strength into his own physical form, leaving their broken bodies bleeding on the cold stone floor. Oryx turned away from the corpses and cut a new tear in the fabric of his throne world. He stepped out of the jagged obsidian room and entered the cold, empty expanse of the ascendant realm. The temperature dropped immediately, forming a thick layer of frost over his hardened carapace. He walked across drifting fragments of crushed rock, navigating through the dark matter toward the deepest pocket of the dimension. He arrived at the domain of Akka, the worm of secrets. The creature spanned the length of a continent, its body looping in massive, overlapping coils around a cluster of jagged planetoids. The worm's thick bone plates scraped against the stone, sending violent vibrations through the surrounding space and reducing the rock to fine dust. Akka's head consisted of a single, continuous shield of pale bone, ending in a jaw lined with thousands of serrated teeth. Thick, glowing mucus dripped from his mandibles and floated in the cold air. Oryx stood on a floating shard of rock, directly in front of the massive entity. He pointed his blood-stained cleaver at Akka's milky white eye. Oryx spoke, sending deep, low-frequency sound waves across the open space. He stated that the larvae and the power of the deep came to the siblings as a gift. He explained that a gift directly violates the mechanics of the sword logic, as true existence requires an organism to take its shape by force. Oryx declared his intention to kill Akka and physically extract the secrets of the deep from the worm's flesh. Akka responded by unhinging his massive jaw and lunging forward to crush the Krill King. Oryx utilized the newly acquired muscular density from Xivu Arath to propel his body upward. He leaped over the snapping teeth and landed heavily on the top of Akka's skull. Oryx drove his cleaver downward, wedging the sharp metal edge between the thick bone plates of the worm's neck. Akka thrashed violently, smashing his long body against the floating planetoids and shattering the rock formations. Oryx held tightly to the hilt, calculating the exact rotation of the worm's movements using the enhanced neural pathways taken from Savathun. He twisted the blade sharply, snapping the heavy vertebrae. Oryx pulled the cleaver free and struck repeatedly at the exposed tissue. He drove the metal through the thick bundles of nerves and pale flesh. The massive head detached completely from the segmented body, drifting away into the cold expanse. Dark, heavy blood pooled around the severed stump, freezing into solid chunks in the low temperature. Oryx stepped off the floating skull and waded through the frozen blood. He plunged his armored hands directly into the severed neck of the colossal worm. He ripped out long, glowing strands of dense nervous tissue, pulling the physical matter containing the encoded knowledge of the deep out of the carcass. He dropped the glowing tissue onto a flat slab of floating rock. Oryx retrieved 2 large flat pieces of black obsidian from the surrounding debris. He held his cleaver like a chisel and carved the extracted knowledge directly into the dark stone. He translated the chemical signals of the worm's nervous system into angular runes, pressing his entire weight into every stroke. The sharp metal cut deep grooves into the obsidian, filling the air with the smell of scorched rock and leaving trails of glowing green light in the stone. Oryx named these heavy objects the Tablets of Ruin. He gathered thick metal chains from the wreckage of the shattered planetoids and bound the stone slabs together. He wrapped the heavy iron links around his waist, securing the tablets against his armored thighs. The glowing green runes illuminated his broad chest and face. He possessed the absolute physical knowledge required to command the fundamental fabric of the universe. Oryx gripped his cleaver and turned his gaze toward the darkest, deepest pocket of the surrounding abyss. He stepped forward through the floating dust and the frozen blood, moving to open a direct channel with the deep itself and claim a power that would alter the physical shapes of his enemies. Oryx walked into the absolute center of the abyss. The ambient light faded to absolute blackness, leaving only the green glow of the runes carved into the heavy obsidian slabs hanging from his waist. The temperature in this sector of the Ascendant Realm dropped to a point where atomic motion nearly ceased. Frost formed a thick crust over the outer layers of his bone plating, and gravity multiplied rapidly, pressing down on his broad shoulders and forcing him to drag his heavy, clawed feet across the floating rock. He stopped at the edge of a massive spherical void in the dark matter. He unhooked the Tablets of Ruin from his metal chains and held the heavy stone slabs in front of his chest. He ran his armored fingers over the jagged grooves of the runes, feeling the sharp edges of the carved rock. Oryx vibrated his vocal cords, producing low-frequency sound waves that matched the exact resonant frequencies of the carved symbols. The sound waves traveled into the spherical void, and the dimensional fabric collapsed inward immediately, generating a massive gravitational singularity. Heavy radiation poured out from the center of the anomaly, washing over Oryx in thick, visible waves of dark energy. The physical mechanics of the deep integrated directly with his biological structure, merging with the parasitic worm inside his abdomen. The radiation flooded his cells, altering his exoskeleton and internal organs at a rapid pace. The bone plates on his head extended backward, forming a high, sweeping crest composed of ultra-dense calcium. His leathery wings grew wider, and the membranes thickened into heavy, bulletproof material. The green light, emanating from his abdomen, shifted to a blinding, cold white, projecting a harsh glare across the floating dust. His physical density increased exponentially, anchoring him firmly against the crushing gravity of the abyss. He absorbed the mathematical formulas of the deep into his neural network, acquiring the exact geometric equations required to fold space and extract physical matter from the universe. He turned away from the singularity, hooked the tablets of ruin back onto his chains, and marched back toward the center of his throne world. He stepped out of the cold abyss and re-entered the jagged obsidian chamber. Savathun and Sivu Arath stood on the dark stone floor, their bodies fully reformed from the matter of their respective sword spaces. They looked at the altered physical shape of their brother as the white light spilled from his eyes and chest, illuminating the dark corners of the room. He spoke with a modified vocal structure, his voice layered with sharp, metallic undertones that vibrated the heavy air. He declared himself the King of Shapes, announcing his new name and stating the word Oryx to his sisters. He designated himself the Taken King, detailing the new physical mechanism he had extracted from the deep anomaly. Oryx demonstrated this mechanism immediately. He raised his heavy, clawed hand and visualized the geometric formula of the deep. A tear opened in the air in front of him, exposing a pocket of the cold, radiation-filled abyss. He extended his gravitational pull through the tear, reaching into the physical universe outside his throne world, and targeted a captured alien soldier chained in the Osmium Court's dungeons. The gravitational force wrapped around the soldier's physical body, dragging the creature through the dimensional layers and pulling it directly into the cold abyss. Inside the high radiation environment, the alien soldier underwent a rapid cellular restructuring. The dark energy flooded the creature's respiratory and circulatory systems, and the radiation stripped away the soft, unnecessary biological functions, leaving only the dense muscle tissue and the hardened skeletal frame. The creature's skin turned a dark, shifting black, absorbing the surrounding light completely. Cold white energy erupted from the creature's eyes and joints, glowing brightly in the dark chamber. The restructuring overwrote the neural pathways in the soldier's brain, replacing all individual survival instincts with a biological mandate to obey the geometric formulas held by Oryx. Oryx closed his fist, and the altered soldier materialized on the obsidian floor of the throne world. The creature stood completely rigid, exhibiting absolute stillness, despite the massive physical trauma of the restructuring. Oryx issued a low vocal command, and the creature immediately pivoted and marched toward the chamber's exit, moving with precise mechanical efficiency. The soldier operated entirely without oxygen or traditional sustenance, powered solely by the dark radiation cycling through its veins. Oryx had acquired the ability to pull living matter into the deep, optimize its physical shape for violence, and reinsert it into reality as an absolutely compliant tool. He called this process taking, and he possessed the sole neurological capacity to execute the equations required to perform it. Savathun and Sivu Arath watched the dark, twitching soldier march away. They inspected the new white light radiating from Oryx's armor, calculating the efficiency of the taking mechanism. The process bypassed the slow, physical act of slaughter and directly converted enemy forces into immediate, powerful assets. Oryx stood at the center of the obsidian chamber, his vast wings folded against his back, commanding a power unmatched by any other organism in the universe. He possessed the mathematical formulas of the deep and the immense physical strength of the King Morph. Oryx walked to the edge of his throne world and cut a large viewing port in the dark matter walls. He looked out at the physical universe, shifting his gaze far beyond the 52 moons of Fundament. His enhanced optical sensors detected a massive accumulation of artificial light and electromagnetic signals spanning thousands of nearby star systems. A highly advanced, multi-species alliance occupied those planets, utilizing complex orbital habitats, dense megastructures, and deep space communication networks. Oryx analyzed the vast population numbers and the heavy military infrastructure of this galactic civilization. He gripped the hilt of his heavy cleaver and prepared to transport his siblings, his hive broods, and his new Taken mechanism into the center of those clustered stars to test the sword logic against a civilization spanning the entire galaxy. Oryx deployed his forces out of the Fundament system and initiated a direct assault against the Ecumene. The Ecumene consisted of a vast galactic union comprising thousands of different species, utilizing advanced orbital habitats and deep space weaponry. They deployed heavy particle cannons and directed energy weapons against the initial hive waves. The Ecumene military easily vaporized the dense carapaces of the hive knights and shattered the bone-hulled ships pushing into their star systems. They recognized the hive's reliance on physical mass and brute force, and they countered it with overwhelming technological superiority. Oryx altered his strategy immediately. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and gripped the tablets of ruin hanging at his waist. He engaged the geometric formulas of the deep, tearing open localized spatial fissures directly behind the Ecumene defensive lines. He extended his gravitational pull through the vacuum of space, grabbing entire battalions of Ecumene soldiers and pulling them into the cold abyss of the Ascendant Realm. The radiation restructured their biological forms, hardening their armor and rewriting their neural pathways. Oryx pushed the soldiers back out into physical space seconds later. The altered soldiers, now glowing with cold white light, immediately turned their weapons on their former allies. They opened fire on the Ecumene command ships, bypassing the heavy frontal shields entirely. The Ecumene Crisis Council observed this new tactical development from their command center on the Fractal Wreath, a massive ring world orbiting a blue giant star. They analyzed the telemetry data and noted the instantaneous conversion of their own troops into hostile assets. The Council identified this paracausal weapon as an anomaly that defied their understanding of physics, acknowledging their complete inability to defend against it. The war stretched across 100 years, shifting from conventional space battles to a systematic dismantling of the Ecumene infrastructure from within. Oryx directed his flagship toward the Fractal Wreath. He opened a massive spatial tear directly above the ring world, bypassing the orbital defense grids entirely. He stepped onto the polished metal floors of the Ecumene Command Center, carrying his heavy cleaver. The Council guards fired their directed energy weapons, but the beams dispersed against the dense dark matter shielding Oryx's carapace. He swung his blade, cutting through the thick metal blast doors and severing the limbs of the remaining guards. He walked into the central chamber and drove his cleaver into the control consoles, shattering the crystalline screens. He slaughtered the council members, spilling their bright blue blood across the pristine floorboards. Oryx stood in the center of the wreckage and focused on the physical act of war. He channeled the massive amount of destructive energy generated by the slaughter of the Ecumene leadership. He recalled the specific shape and brutal mechanics of his sister, Xivu Arath, whom he had killed in his throne world. He willed the violent energy to coalesce around the pooled blood. The dark matter condensed rapidly, forming thick, interlocking armor plates and heavy, spiked limbs. Xivu Arath reformed from the sheer kinetic force of the massacre. She stood up from the shattered consoles, gripping her massive warhammer, resurrected through an act of supreme warfare. The Ecumene forces fractured without their central command. Various client species attempted to form isolated resistance pockets, The Dakawa nest, a species of highly intelligent, multi-limbed tacticians, gathered their remaining fleet in a dense asteroid field. Oryx contacted the Dakawa leaders using intercepted communication frequencies. He fed them false tactical data, convincing them that Sivu Arath was isolated and vulnerable on a nearby moon. The Dakawa nest deployed their entire fleet, abandoning their fortified position to strike the supposed target. Sivu Arath met the Dakawa fleet on the rocky surface of the moon, swinging her hammer and crushing the hulls of the landed dropships. While the Dakawa focused entirely on the massive hive god, Oryx utilized the energy generated by the elaborate deception. He shaped the dark matter around the concept of absolute cunning. The physical matter bonded together, forming an elongated skull and sharp, serrated claws. Savathun materialized on the ridge overlooking the battlefield, resurrected by an act of absolute trickery. She immediately deployed toxic gas spores into the Dakawa ship vents, suffocating the crews before they could take off. The three siblings stood together on the rocky moon, fully restored and commanding a unified hive army. They spent the next 1,000 years hunting down the remnants of the Ecumene. They systematically destroyed the orbital habitats, burned the agricultural worlds to ash, and slaughtered the fleeing civilian transports. They pushed the Ecumene into complete extinction, feeding the massive worms inside their guts with the destruction of an entire galactic civilization. The physical universe bent around their violence, solidifying their absolute dominance over the local star systems. Oryx commanded his broods to establish a strict hierarchy of violence, structuring his civilization around the physical mechanics of the deep. He carved the laws of the tithe directly into the obsidian walls of his throne world, ensuring that every kill executed by his forces fed the massive worms residing in their guts. The system operated as a continuous flow of physical energy moving upward from the lowest ranks. The thralls, the smallest and most numerous of the hive, rushed forward with their sharp claws and tore into the flesh of their enemies. They consumed enough of the resulting dark energy to sustain their own larvae and passed the surplus upward to the acolytes. The acolytes fired their dark matter rifles from a distance, gathering the energy from the thralls and their own kills. They retained a portion of this energy to harden their carapaces and transferred the rest to the massive knights and the floating wizards. The knights swung their heavy cleavers through the ranks of the remaining Ecumene forces, generating massive spikes of destructive force. The wizards wove complex geometric formulas in the air, converting the physical matter of their targets into raw fuel. These commanders took their necessary share to maintain their own massive, hungry parasites, and then they directed the remaining flow of energy directly into the Ascendant realm. The Ascendant hive, the generals and champions who possessed their own pocket dimensions within the sword space, collected this vast tribute. They filtered the energy, allowing it to pulse through the dark matter architecture of their throne worlds, and funneled the concentrated result straight to the top of the hierarchy. Oryx, Savathun, and Sivu Arath received this continuous, massive influx of physical destruction. The energy poured into their bodies, neutralizing the corrosive acid generated by the colossal worms housed inside their abdomens. This system prevented the parasites from turning on their hosts, allowing the three siblings to focus entirely on their specific biological mandates. Sivu Arath directed her war moons into the densest star clusters, physically testing her strength against the heavily armored Ecumene dreadnoughts. Savathun positioned her broods in the shadows of gas giants, manipulating the communication frequencies of her enemies and orchestrating elaborate ambushes. Oryx stood on the bridge of his flagship, navigating the complex spatial tiers and directing his taken soldiers to collapse the enemy defenses from the inside out. The tithe system functioned flawlessly as a massive, self-feeding engine of death. However, the exact mechanics of the tithe presented a localized contradiction to the strict rules of the sword logic. The dark energy moved upward not through an act of forceful taking, but through an organized system of giving. The thralls surrendered their surplus energy to the acolytes. The ascendant hive voluntarily directed their tribute to the three gods. This subtle physical exchange of energy bypassed the direct application of force required by the deep. The system ensured the immediate survival of the hive hierarchy, yet it relied on a structural compromise, establishing a massive chain of tribute built on submission rather than sheer kinetic conquest. Savathun and Shivu Arath cornered Oryx in a dense pocket of the ascendant realm. They drove their heavy blades through his chest plating and pushed him down into a lightless chasm. They sealed the spatial tear above him, leaving him stranded in the cold dark matter. Oryx gripped the hilt of his sword, Willbreaker, and swung the jagged metal against the dense fabric of the dimension. He dragged the blade through the compressed rock and radiation, carving a physical path back to his throne world. He climbed up through the fresh fissure, pulling his massive armored body onto the polished obsidian floor of his central chamber. Thick black fluid dripped from the cuts in his carapace and pooled on the stone. Oryx monitored the flow of green energy rising from the lower tiers of his army. The tribute wavered slightly, flickering as his sisters diverted portions of the tithe into their own domains. Oryx understood the mechanical vulnerability of relying solely on his broods and commanders. He required direct biological descendants to secure the upward flow of physical energy and anchor his position at the apex of the hierarchy. Oryx walked to the breeding pits, located beneath the main platform of his throne world. He reached into the warm, green-lit fluid and extracted raw krill biomass. He carried the dripping material back to his obsidian altar and exposed it to the raw radiation of the deep. The biomass expanded, forming thick bone plating and heavy corded muscles. The dark matter solidified into a towering night morph. The new hive opened its eyes, radiating cold white light across the dark stone. Oryx handed the massive creature a heavy, crude cleaver forged from compressed star metal. He spoke to the towering night, vibrating the air with low-frequency sound waves. He named the creature Crota. He assigned him the title Eater of Hope. Oryx projected a holographic map of the cosmos above the altar, highlighting a massive, smooth white sphere traveling across the star systems. He instructed Crota to track the pale sphere and slaughter the species living in its light. He demanded that Crota earn his place in the High War by generating a massive volume of destruction and funneling the resulting energy directly to the throne. Crota gripped the heavy cleaver and stepped back, standing at attention beside the altar. Oryx then extracted a second mass of biological material from the pits. He shaped another sun on the dark stone. This creature possessed a narrow skeletal frame and thin limbs. He named this second son Nokris. Nokris stood before his father, holding his hands out and weaving faint, glowing runes in the air. He generated raw magical energy, avoiding the physical application of force required by the sword logic. Oryx looked at the thin frame and the glowing runes. He raised his heavy armored foot and kicked Nokris in the chest, shattering the thin bone plates and sending the creature skidding across the obsidian floor. Oryx pointed his cleaver at the exit. Nokris dragged his broken body out of the chamber, leaving a trail of dark fluid on the stone. Nokris moved down into the lightless caverns beneath the throne world, crawling toward the massive, coiled segments of the worm god's soul to offer his glowing runes in exchange for power. Oryx turned his attention back to the altar. He reached into a pouch at his waist and produced a single, pale lava. The segmented creature wriggled in his armored palm, secreting thick mucus. Oryx placed the pale worm precisely in the center of the dark stone slab. He raised Willbreaker high above his head. He brought the heavy iron blade down, driving the sharp edge straight through the center of the lava. The metal struck the obsidian altar, emitting a loud, ringing crack. The blade severed the worm into two equal pieces. The two halves of the lava convulsed violently on the stone. They absorbed the residual radiation leaking from Oryx's carapace. The severed ends fused into new, rapidly expanding bone structures. The pale flesh turned dark and hardened into dense plates. The two forms elongated, sprouting tattered, leathery robes and narrow, angular skulls. They hovered above the altar, suspended in the air by localized gravity fields. They opened their eyes simultaneously, projecting bright green light. Oryx named the newly formed twins Ir-Anuk and Ir-Halak. The twin daughters floated in the center of the dark chamber. They immediately began weaving complex geometric runes in the cold air, intertwining lines of dark energy with precise mathematical calculations. They vocalized a high, piercing resonance that vibrated the metal fixtures along the walls. Oryx recognized the destructive potential of the sound waves they produced. He designated the twins as Death Singers. Ir-Anuk and Ir-Halak shifted their glowing runes, manipulating the raw matter of the ascendant realm. They pulled dark energy from the surrounding chasm and compressed it into a dense, spherical mass. They sought to build a physical structure capable of separating their deaths from their bodies, hiding their mortality within the fabric of the throne world. Crota stood at the edge of the chamber, gripping his heavy cleaver. He watched his sisters fold the dimensional space. He lifted his blade, preparing to cut his own fissure into the air to study the foreign realms located beyond the obsidian walls. Ir-Anuk and Ir-Halak stabilized the compressed mass of dark energy above the obsidian altar. They pulled thick strings of radiation from the surrounding chasm and wove them into a dense, spherical shell. Inside this glowing green structure, the twins deposited the biological mechanisms responsible for their own cellular degradation and death. They separated their mortality from their physical bodies, storing the vulnerable biomatter within the hovering sphere. This construct, the Oversoul, provided a localized backup of their neural pathways and biological blueprints. If an enemy destroyed their physical bodies, the Oversoul would reconstruct their flesh and bone immediately. They established a physical law within the throne world, allowing them to survive total bodily decimation. Oryx stood before the hovering sphere, analyzing the complex geometry of the twin daughters' work. He turned to his son, Crota. He gripped the heavy, spiked plating on Crota's shoulder and commanded him to observe the sisters. Oryx instructed Crota to learn the meticulous calculations and precise spatial folds utilized by the twins, seeking to instill strategic calculation alongside Crota's raw kinetic output. Consequently, Oryx turned and walked back into the deepest pocket of the Ascendant Realm, carrying the Tablets of Ruin to study the heavy gravitational forces of the deep. Savathun observed Oryx's departure from a high ridge of dark matter. She descended the jagged slope and approached Crota. She pointed a long, clawed finger at a specific coordinate in the dimensional fabric of the high war. She instructed Crota to swing his heavy cleaver at that precise point, stating that he would discover a new dimension of raw material to conquer. Crota gripped his star metal cleaver and channeled dense kinetic energy into his muscles. He swung the massive blade, slicing through the specified coordinate. The dimensional fabric tore open, exposing a portal of bright, static white light. Metallic structures stepped through the tear immediately. Bipedal frames, constructed from brass and copper alloys, marched onto the obsidian floor. Each unit possessed a single central optic glowing with red light, and thick fluid circulated through glass cylinders embedded in their torsos. These were the Vex, a machine species driven by absolute computational expansion. They poured through the portal in tight, organized formations, carrying weapons that discharged superheated solar plasma. The beams struck the dark stone and the surrounding hive knights, melting through the chitin armor and igniting the localized atmosphere. Crota roared and charged into the metallic ranks. He swung his cleaver in wide arcs, severing the brass chassis and spilling the white fluid across the flagstones. The hive broods rushed forward to engage the machines, tearing at the copper plating with their claws. The Vex responded by calculating the exact physical mechanics of the throne world. They analyzed the dark energy released by the hive's kinetic strikes and measured the resulting expansion of the Ascendant Realm. The Vex processing cores deduced the parameters of the sword logic quickly. They understood that the local physics rewarded absolute violence and the physical domination of space. The Vex immediately integrated this logic into their central processors. They constructed massive, multi-story computational frames from the crushed rock and dark matter of the throne world. They directed their units to perform calculated, ritualistic executions of the hive soldiers, maximizing the release of dark energy to strengthen their own metallic plating. They designated specific submines to process the geometric formulas of the deep, dedicating vast processing power to the pursuit of physical superiority. The machines matched the hive strikes, piling severed copper limbs over cracked bone carapaces. The air grew thick with the smell of scorched ozone and burning chitin. This physical grinding of metal and bone covered the obsidian floor, accumulating into massive mounds of debris as the conflict persisted for 100 solar cycles. Deep within the cold abyss, the worm god Ear sensed the massive influx of foreign machinery inside the High War. Ear generated a low-frequency vibration that struck Oryx directly, shaking his dense armor plates. The sound waves transmitted a direct command, demanding that Oryx return to the upper levels and re-establish control over the throne world. Oryx climbed back up the jagged chasm, pulling himself onto the edge of the central chamber. He observed the towering Vex computational frames and the thousands of brass units firing solar plasma across his domain. Oryx unhooked the tablets of ruin from his chains. He projected a series of massive gravitational tears directly over the densest Vex formations. The localized singularities grabbed the brass frames and pulled them forcefully into the radiation-filled void. The dark energy flooded the Vex fluid cores and restructured their metallic plating, converting the brass into shifting, light-absorbing dark matter. The geometric shapes of the machines twisted and locked into highly optimized, lethal configurations. Cold white energy erupted from their single optics. Oryx pushed the altered machines back into the High War. The taken Vex immediately turned their weapons on the regular Vex units. The resulting crossfire of solar plasma and dark radiation vaporized the invading machines rapidly. The taken Minotaurs and Goblins dismantled the massive computational frames, breaking the metal constructs into scattered debris and melting the copper wiring. Oryx secured the obsidian chamber, leaving the piles of shattered brass and the glowing white portal entirely exposed. He walked across the debris field and approached his son. He gripped Crota by the thick collar of his neck armor, lifting the heavy knight off the stone floor. Oryx dragged Crota toward the bright static light of the torn dimensional fabric, preparing to physically hurl his son into the expansive Vex machine network to enforce a harsh physical penalty for his vulnerability. Oryx threw Crota directly into the center of the static white light. The heavy knight tumbled through the dimensional tear, disappearing entirely into the Vex machine network. The spatial fabric sealed shut behind him, cutting off his access to the high war. Crota landed heavily on the metallic surfaces of a Vex orbital structure. He gripped his heavy cleaver and immediately engaged the surrounding units, smashing the brass chassis and severing the copper limbs. He carved a violent path through the mechanical corridors, establishing his own localized tribute system to sustain the worm inside his abdomen. He built massive temples out of crushed Vex metal and dedicated the physical slaughter entirely to the deep and to his father. He achieved godhood within the network, imposing the sword logic upon the mathematical systems of the Vex. Back in the High War, Oryx surveyed the massive mounds of Vex debris covering the obsidian floor. He calculated the vulnerability of his throne world. His sisters had invaded his domain previously, and the Vex had successfully breached his defenses by analyzing a localized dimensional fold. Oryx concluded that anchoring his throne world to a fixed spatial coordinate invited constant infiltration. He resolved to mobilize his ascendant realm, converting the entire physical structure into a moving flagship capable of navigating the material universe. Oryx returned to the cold abyss and retrieved the severed, frozen remains of Akka, the worm god. He dragged the massive, segmented plates out of the dark matter void and deposited them onto the floor of the High War. He gripped Willbreaker and began to carve the colossal worm's bone plating. He sliced through the thick armor and hollowed out the dense spinal columns. He shaped the immense fossilized segments into the hull of a massive dreadnought. The ship spanned thousands of miles in length, dwarfing the size of the Osmium Court's original floating continent. The dark bone absorbed the ambient light, casting a heavy shadow across the throne world. The sheer mass of the vessel warped the local gravity field, pulling the surrounding dark matter directly into its hull. Oryx inverted the physical dimensions of his throne world, folding the entire ascendant realm inward and binding it strictly to the internal volume of the massive bone ship. He created a mobile fortress, where his internal domain and the external reality occupied the exact same physical space. He required heavy paracausal weaponry to defend this new structure. He summoned his Taken forces and directed them to ambush Savathun and Xivu Arath within their own localized domains. The Taken soldiers swarmed the siblings' throne worlds, engaging the Hive guards and creating massive diversions. During the chaos, Oryx entered Xivu Arath's armory and stole her heavy warhammer. He then breached Savathun's chambers and extracted her thin, serrated scalpel. Oryx returned to the dreadnought and brought the stolen weapons to the central forge. He activated the heavy thermal vents, filling the chamber with superheated gas. He placed the massive warhammer and the serrated scalpel onto the anvil. He gripped Willbreaker and struck the weapons repeatedly, breaking the dense metals down into raw, molten material. He mixed the liquid alloys with crushed Vex brass and forged thick, interlocking armor plates for the exterior of his ship. Xivu Arath arrived at the dreadnought's docking bays shortly after, seeking to retaliate for the theft. She charged up the main ramp, swinging a massive cleaver. Oryx deployed the newly forged armor plating, sealing the blast doors and engaging the heavy gravitational shielding. Sivu Arath's cleaver struck the bone hull, but the dark matter absorbed the kinetic impact entirely. Oryx ignited the main thrusters, pushing the massive dreadnought out of the Ascendant realm and into the physical universe, leaving his sister stranded on the obsidian docks. The massive bone hull of the dreadnought pushed through the dense accretion disk of a black hole, crushing the orbiting rock and ice of the Harmony star system. Thousands of heavy hive dropships swarmed the surrounding gas giants, deploying armored knights and acolytes onto the floating orbital habitats. The Harmony species utilized agile, silver-hulled sting ships and heavy plasma artillery to defend their central worlds. The Vex also operated within this exact spatial territory, expanding their metallic architecture across the fractured planetoids and engaging both the Harmony fleets and the invading hive broods. The Vex Collective analyzed the massive physical destruction generated by the hive and subsequently manufactured a towering Axis mind, designated Korea Blade Transform. Korea consisted of thick brass plating, complex interlocking gears, and hundreds of cylindrical glass conduits pumping luminous, white radiolarian fluid. The machine deployed directly to the front lines and captured live hive specimens during the skirmishes. Korea dragged the thrashing knights and acolytes into its metallic laboratories and strapped them to copper dissection tables. The Axis mind utilized precision laser scalpels to slice open the chitinous armor and extract the writhing, pale worms from the hive abdomens. Korea recorded the specific release of dark energy occurring during these physical executions. The machine observed the upward flow of tribute and calculated the exact geometric patterns required to generate paracausal power. Korea immediately constructed a mechanical priesthood to replicate this process. The Axis mind organized hundreds of bipedal Vex minotaurs into precise, concentric circles on the metal floor. The machines raised their heavy bronze weapons and systematically severed the heads of captured alien specimens. The minotaurs generated localized bursts of kinetic energy and channeled the resulting power upward into Korea's central processing core. The machines rubbed their copper joints together and emitted rhythmic, metallic grinding noises, producing a physical approximation of religious chanting to satisfy the conditions of the deep. Oryx detected this localized accumulation of dark energy and stepped directly from his dreadnought into the center of the Vex computational matrix, carrying his heavy cleaver, Willbreaker. Korea processed the massive physical dimensions and the intense radiation emitting from the taken king. The Axis mind dedicated its entire processing network to projecting a structural model of Oryx to identify a tactical vulnerability. The Vex fluid cores operated with data architecture limited strictly to standard baryonic matter, and therefore the projectors omitted the paracausal radiation of the deep entirely. The hard light emitters projected only the original biological blueprint of the organism. A glowing hologram flickered into existence on the metal deck, solidifying into the exact shape of Oryx. The hologram displayed the short, fragile limbs and the thin, brittle carapace of the 2-year-old krill female from Fundament. The projection of Oryx stared at the towering, winged, bone-plated structure of the taken king. She scanned the piles of shattered Vex frames and the thick black fluid dripping from the edge of Willbreaker. She opened her mandibles and emitted high-pitched vocalizations. She demanded the exact physical locations of Sathona and Shiro. She requested a detailed explanation for the massive physical mutations and the widespread slaughter surrounding them. Oryx looked down at the fragile biological model of his former self. He shifted his heavy shoulder plates and expelled short, rhythmic bursts of air from his respiratory vents, producing a low, rumbling vibration in his chest. He raised his heavy, clawed hand and opened a spatial tear directly over Couria's brass chassis. The localized gravity pulled the massive Axis mind into the cold abyss of the Ascendant realm. The radiation fused with Couria's fluid cores, turning its brass exterior black and illuminating its central optic with cold white light. Oryx preserved specific sections of Couria's original computational algorithms, maintaining the machine's capacity to run complex simulations and analyze enemy tactics. Oryx pulled the altered machine back into physical space and transported it to Savathun's nearby command ship. He stood on the deck of her vessel and handed the dark, twitching frame over to his sister. He presented the taken Axis mind as an asset for her strategic networks, providing her with a tool capable of deducing the hidden mechanics of her enemies. Savathun gripped the heavy black chassis, her elongated skull reflecting the white light of the machine's optic, and she directed her broods to secure the entity within her deepest containment vaults. Oryx returned to the navigation deck of the dreadnought and accessed the sensory databanks connected to the ship's external optical arrays. The screens displayed the visual track of a massive, smooth white sphere accelerating rapidly out of the local star cluster. Oryx calculated the exact trajectory of the sphere's exhaust trail, recognizing the physical signature of the traveler. He grasped the heavy steering columns and rotated the colossal bone ship. He ignited the primary thrusters, driving his entire fleet forward to pursue the pale sphere toward a distant planetary system inhabited by a four-armed, oxygen-breathing species on a world called Rhys. The massive white sphere hung over the planet Rhys, projecting a field of terraforming radiation across the surface. The four-armed Elixni species utilized this energy to construct towering geometric cities from bright metal and spun glass. They established complex agricultural zones across the previously barren plains and launched their own orbital platforms to connect their global settlements. The traveler pushed the Elixni out of their harsh industrial cycles and directly into a period of rapid physical expansion and technological development. Oryx drove the dreadnought into the outer edge of the Rhys star system. The massive bone ship displaced the surrounding orbital debris, sending high-velocity asteroids crashing into the outer planets. A fleet of thousands of black, pyramid-shaped vessels emerged from hyperspace directly alongside the Hive forces. These ships consisted of smooth, featureless dark matter, operating without visible thrusters or exhaust trails. They belonged to the Black Fleet, the physical extension of the deep itself. The two massive armadas converged on Rhys, blocking the light of the local star and casting a dense physical shadow over the Elixni cities. The Elixni registered the sudden drop in solar radiation and activated their planetary defense grids. They fired heavy particle cannons from their ground stations, but the beams dispersed harmlessly against the dark matter hulls of the Black Fleet. The pyramids projected localized gravity waves, pulling the Elixni orbital platforms out of alignment and crashing them into the glass cities below. The impact shattered the towering structures, sending clouds of sharp debris rolling across the plains. Oryx deployed his hive broods directly into the resulting wreckage. The knights and acolytes marched through the shattered streets, swinging their cleavers and firing dark matter rifles into the fleeing Elixni civilians. The traveler detected the overwhelming concentration of paracausal energy from the deep. The massive sphere immediately terminated its terraforming radiation. It retracted its physical tethers from the planet's surface, severing the energy conduits that powered the Elixni infrastructure. The white sphere accelerated rapidly upward, breaking through the planetary atmosphere and entering hyperspace. The physical shockwave from its departure shattered the remaining glass spires and leveled the agricultural zones, plunging the entire planet into total darkness and plunging the temperature to freezing levels. The Elixni civilization collapsed completely under the combined assault of the Hive and the Black Fleet. The surviving leaders of the global houses turned their weapons on one another in a desperate bid to secure the remaining food and fuel reserves. The House of Wolves launched a localized orbital strike against the House of Judgment, vaporizing their strongholds. The House of Kings deployed heavy mechanized walkers to crush the supply depots of the House of Devils. The once unified species splintered into violent factions, executing one another while the Hive marched through the ruins to collect the resulting dark energy. The surviving Elixni abandoned their ruined world. They boarded their massive, armored transport ketches and launched themselves into deep space, leaving billions of dead across the frozen surface. The radiation from the deep warped their biology during their escape. Their ether-processing organs mutated, requiring constant heavy consumption of the synthetic gas to prevent physical starvation. The proud Elixni engineers and scholars devolved into ruthless, scavenging pirates. They became the Fallen. They directed their massive, rust-colored ketches toward the projected hyperspace trajectory of the traveler. They initiated a long, violent drift across the galaxy, executing continuous raids against passing species to fuel their ships, driven entirely by the physical imperative to reclaim the massive machine that had abandoned them to the whirlwind. Oryx monitored the deep space telemetry data on the Dreadnought's command console. He observed the massive white sphere, altering its trajectory across multiple star systems, pulling away from the devastation of Rius. He formulated a plan to pursue the machine, aiming to eliminate the entity that consistently shielded weaker civilizations from the physical mechanics of the sword logic. Oryx turned to the jagged tier he had left open to the Vex network. He transmitted a localized command through the Ascendant Realm, forcing Crota to return to the Obsidian floor. The Heavy Knight stepped back into the throne world, covered in white Vex fluid and carrying his battered cleaver. Oryx pointed toward the holographic projection of the escaping white sphere. He ordered Crota to command the vanguard forces and hunt the machine down, instructing him to track the residual light left in its wake. Crota departed the Dreadnought and took command of a massive fleet of Hive seed ships. He drove the vessels through hyperspace, following the faint electromagnetic trail of the white sphere. He tracked the signal across vast expanses of deep space, passing through empty planetary systems and dead asteroid belts. The pursuit lasted for centuries, bringing the Hive fleet directly into a stable, single-star system. The telemetry data indicated the white sphere had stopped its forward momentum and established a low orbit over the third planet in the system. The planet possessed a nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere and vast surface oceans, heavily populated by a bipedal species utilizing combustion engines and rudimentary orbital satellites. This was the Sol system, and the planet was Earth. Crota did not launch a direct assault on the populated world immediately. He ordered his fleet to land on the rocky, heavily cratered surface of the moon, orbiting the planet. The Hive seed ships impacted the gray lunar dust, driving deep into the rock. Crota directed his knights and acolytes to dig vast subterranean networks beneath the surface. They carved massive caverns and winding tunnels out of the solid moon rock, establishing breeding pits and staging grounds for a future invasion. They constructed heavy launch tubes and dark matter artillery batteries, aiming them directly at the blue planet turning in the sky above. The human population on Earth detected the Hive activity on the moon, They utilized their advanced Golden Age sensor arrays, observing the massive structural changes on the lunar surface. In response to the perceived threat, the humans mobilized a massive force. They deployed thousands of armed personnel, clad in thick combat armor and carrying advanced kinetic and directed energy weapons. These soldiers landed on the lunar surface and advanced toward the hive tunnels, aiming to eliminate the alien presence before it could launch an attack on Earth. Crota stood at the entrance to the largest subterranean cavern. He gripped his massive star metal cleaver and watched the human forces march across the gray dust. He waited until the soldiers entered the firing range of the hive batteries. Crota raised his blade and issued a single, loud vocal command. Thousands of hive knights and acolytes surged out of the dark tunnels, swarming across the lunar surface. The sheer physical mass of the hive forces overwhelmed the human lines immediately. The human kinetic weapons chipped the chitin armor, but the hive continued their forward momentum. Crota charged into the center of the human formation. He swung his heavy cleaver, cutting through the combat armor and severing limbs. He smashed the soldiers into the lunar dust, generating massive spikes of dark energy with every kill. The human forces broke completely, falling back in a chaotic retreat toward their landing zones. The engagement concluded with a total physical victory for the hive. The surface of the moon was covered in the shattered remains of human armor and broken weapons. Crota established total dominance over the lunar satellite, solidifying his position within the Sol system. He returned to his subterranean chambers and channeled the massive amount of dark energy generated by the slaughter directly into his own localized throne world. He fed the worm inside his abdomen and prepared to launch the next phase of the invasion, aiming to strike the blue planet directly and destroy the white sphere hovering in its sky. Meanwhile, far out in deep space, Oryx continued to monitor the expansion of his broods, completely unaware of the precise sequence of events unfolding within the Sol system. 6 figures, clad in heavy, articulated combat armor, stepped out of a small transport ship and onto the gray dust of the lunar surface. Ariana 3, an exo constructed from metal alloys and synthetic musculature, led the group toward the massive, jagged crater known as the Hellmouth. She carried a hand cannon, radiating localized thermal heat. Beside her walked Eris Morn, a human hunter wrapped in thick leather cloaks, and Toland, an aging warlock clutching a heavy tome filled with hand-drawn geometric runes. Vel Tarlo, a massive titan wearing thick, lead-reinforced shoulder plates, marched behind them alongside 2 other operatives, Sai Mota and Omar Aga. They walked past the shattered remnants of the previous human army and descended directly into the dark, subterranean tunnels carved by the hive. They intended to bypass the frontline broods, locate the central breeding pits, and assassinate Crota in his subterranean chambers. The air inside the Hellmouth grew damp and thick, with the scent of ozone and decaying biological matter. The fire team moved through the winding limestone corridors, relying on the artificial light emitted by their hovering mechanical ghosts. As they reached a narrow intersection of tunnels, thousands of thralls dropped from the jagged ceiling. The small, pale creatures swarmed over the metal grates, swinging their sharp, bone-crusted claws. Vel Tarlo stepped to the front of the formation and channeled high-voltage electrical currents through his armored gauntlets. He swung his fists, discharging the arc energy into the rushing thralls and turning their brittle carapaces into scattered ash. The sheer volume of the pale creatures pressed against him, stacking their bodies over his heavy armor and pinning his arms to his sides. A towering knight named Alak stepped out of the shadows, dragging a massive iron axe across the stone floor. Alak swung the heavy weapon in a wide arc, driving the sharp edge through the dense plating of Vel Tarlo's chest and severing his spine. The surge of thousands of hive bodies drove the remaining human operatives apart, pushing them down separate, pitch-black corridors. Omar Aga stumbled into a circular chamber illuminated by green thermal vents. Several heavy knights grabbed his arms and pinned his back against a stalagmite. A floating hive wizard, designated as the Heart of Crota, approached him and plunged her sharp clawed fingers directly into the center of his chest plate. She ripped the luminous physical light energy out of his biological cells. The wizard carried the bright, pulsing fluid over to a shallow pit filled with writhing, pale larvae. She squeezed the light from her hands, dripping the raw energy onto the worms and accelerating their physical growth, while Omar bled out against the rock. In an adjacent tunnel, Saimota moved silently along the damp walls, gripping twin daggers infused with electrical currents. She attempted to flank the hive commanders, controlling the intersection. A massive, shrieking wizard named Omnigull descended from a high ledge and released a thick cloud of corrosive, green gas. The acidic vapor settled over Saimota, eating through the hermetic seals of her combat suit and melting the synthetic fibers underneath. Dozens of thralls rushed through the smoke and drove their jagged bone swords through the weakened armor plates, piercing her vital organs and leaving her body in the acidic pool. Toland walked alone into a vast open cavern filled with towering obsidian pillars. He carried a small brass recording device in his hand. He tracked a high-frequency audio signal echoing from the far end of the room. He found the death singer, Ir Yut, floating above a stone altar. She wove complex acoustic frequencies in the air, vibrating the oxygen molecules with a song that translated physical existence into geometric dissolution. Toland lowered his weapons entirely. He stood perfectly still, pointing his recording device at the wizard to capture the precise audio wavelengths. The intense sound waves ruptured his eardrums and vibrated his cellular structure apart. His biological tissue disintegrated into fine gray ash, dropping his metal armor onto the floorboards, while his consciousness shifted out of the physical universe and into the ascendant realm. Ariana III pushed through the dark catacombs, igniting her internal solar reserves. Superheated plasma radiated from her metallic chassis, melting the limestone walls and turning the damp floor into liquid slag. She breached the lower chambers of the Hellmouth, confronting a solid wall of heavily armored knights, blocking the path to Crota's inner sanctum. Ariana III fired continuous blasts from her hand cannon, burning massive holes through the dark chitin and incinerating the tissue underneath. The hive broods marched forward through the molten rock, swinging their cleavers in unison. The heavy iron blades struck her thermal shields, shattering the energy barriers and driving the sharp metal deep into her synthetic torso. She collapsed onto the smoking ground, terminating her solar output. Eris Morn stood alone in a lightless fissure deep beneath the lunar surface. A roaming knight swung a heavy sword, striking her hovering ghost and crushing the small mechanical frame into scattered metal fragments. The destruction of the ghost severed her connection to the light entirely. Eris crawled through the narrow, jagged rock formations, moving blindly through the dark. She ambushed an isolated hive acolyte, driving a bone knife through the creature's neck. She used the sharp blade to extract the 3 glowing green optic organs from the creature's skull. Blood dripped down her face as she pressed the biological hive eyes into her own eye sockets, forcing the alien optic nerves to fuse with her brain. The green light illuminated the pitch-black tunnels, She wrapped herself in a torn, dark cloak and pressed her back against the cold stone, feeding on blind, translucent insects crawling in the damp dirt, committing herself to a long, solitary survival in the dark. Eris Morn dragged her body over the jagged limestone rim of the hellmouth. Thick green fluid leaked from her 3 grafted optic organs, staining the grey lunar dust beneath her hands. She wore the frayed, ash-covered remnants of her leather cloak, dragging her heavy boots across the cratered surface. She carried a piece of fractured bone taken from a slain hive knight and a small, cracked optical sensor salvaged from her destroyed ghost. She walked for miles across the desolate landscape, breathing the thin, localized atmosphere retained by the hive structures. She located a derelict human jump ship buried under a thick layer of regolith. She cleared the dust from the heavy glass canopy, manually bypassed the rusted external locks, and climbed into the cramped cockpit. She engaged the sublight thrusters, directing the vibrating vessel toward the blue planet turning in the sky above. The small ship rattled violently upon entering the planetary atmosphere. Eris landed the smoking vessel on the concrete platforms of the human defensive stronghold, known as the Tower. She approached the Vanguard commanders standing around their metal tactical table. She placed the fractured bone and the broken optical sensor directly onto the illuminated hololith. She described the exact dimensional coordinates of Crota's localized throne world, tracing the physical layout of the Ascendant Realm with her dirt-stained fingers. A single Guardian accepted the coordinates and traveled to the lunar surface. This soldier wore dense plasteel armor layered over a synthetic mesh undersuit and carried a heavy kinetic rifle loaded with armor-piercing tungsten rounds. The Guardian descended through the dark limestone tunnels of the Hellmouth, stepping over the scorched metal fragments of Ariana III's chassis and the dried bloodstains marking the previous incursions. The tunnels grew wider and warmer, transitioning from raw moon rock to smooth, carved obsidian. Heavy iron chains hung from the vaulted ceilings, suspending massive braziers burning with pale green fire. The air carried the thick, metallic scent of ozone and burning chitin. The Guardian bypassed the outer patrol broods, moving deep into the subterranean complex until reaching the central breeding pits. A bright white tear in the spatial fabric hung above the stone floor, leaking cold radiation into the cavern. The Guardian stepped directly into the bright light, passing through the dimensional threshold and entering the Oversoul Throne. The Oversoul Throne consisted of flat obsidian platforms suspended over a deep chasm of swirling dark matter. A massive, glowing green sphere hovered near the ceiling, radiating cold, pale light across the dark stone. 2 hive death singers floated above elevated altars on either side of the central chasm. They wove complex acoustic frequencies in the air, vibrating the oxygen molecules to separate physical matter from its underlying energy. The Guardian raised the heavy kinetic rifle and fired a continuous stream of tungsten rounds into the floating wizards. The bullets shattered their bone carapaces and disrupted their vocal cords, dropping their broken bodies onto the stone altars and silencing the destructive sound waves. Crota stood on the central platform. He possessed an ethereal, translucent green carapace, having retreated completely into his ascendant form to gather tribute from his broods. He held his massive star metal cleaver in both hands. He swung the heavy blade through the air, sending physical shockwaves of dark energy across the gaps between the platforms. The Guardian dodged the heavy kinetic blasts, rolling across the rough obsidian floor and taking cover behind a jagged stalagmite. The Guardian targeted the ascendant swordbearers, guarding the lower bridges. The Guardian fired high-caliber rounds into the thick joints of the swordbearers' armor, shattering the chitin and dropping the heavy creatures to the stone. The Guardian ran across the bridge and picked up the large, glowing bone cleaver dropped by the fallen enemy. The Guardian utilized the physical mechanics of the sword logic, wielding the dense mass of the hive weapon to generate raw paracausal force. The Guardian charged across the main obsidian platform and swung the stolen cleaver directly into Crota's translucent chest. The jagged bone edge fractured Crota's outer energy shielding. The heavy impact pushed the towering hive god backward across the stone floor. Crota swung his star metal blade down, striking the obsidian and sending shards of dark stone flying into the air. The Guardian sidestepped the heavy blow and drove the stolen cleaver deeper into Crota's torso. The physical force of the weapon severed the dark matter conduits, supplying energy to Crota's limbs. The Guardian lifted the bone blade high into the air and brought it down repeatedly, chopping through the thick layers of ascendant tissue with heavy, wet impacts. Crota's physical structure collapsed under the sustained kinetic force. Bright white radiation erupted from the deep fissures in his translucent carapace. The heavy star metal cleaver slipped from his hands and clattered loudly against the floorboards. His body dissolved into floating ash and loose streams of green energy, dissipating entirely into the surrounding vacuum. The oversoul sphere hovering above the altar fractured, breaking into large shards of crystalline matter that rained down onto the dark stone. The destruction of Crota released a massive shockwave of physical energy. This wave of dark radiation expanded outward from the localized throne world, ripping through the dimensional fabric of the ascendant realm. The energy pulse traveled across the vast dark matter void, crossing the physical distance of the star system, moving rapidly toward the exact deep space coordinates occupied by the towering bone hull of the dreadnought. Oryx stood on the central navigation deck of the dreadnought. Far out in the dark matter void, he registered a sudden, massive drop in the continuous flow of dark energy funneling into his throne world. He checked the dimensional telemetry data immediately. The signal, originating from Crota's localized ascendant space, had vanished completely, indicating the total physical decimation of his son's biological structure and the shattering of the oversoul. The tithe system connecting the lunar broods directly to the dreadnought fractured, severing the energy supply. The massive worm inside Oryx's abdomen writhed violently against his intestinal walls, secreting a heavy dose of corrosive acid into his stomach to protest the sudden lack of tribute. Oryx gripped the edge of the control console, buckling the heavy bone plating under his fingers. He pulled the deep space tracking data from the ship's arrays, pinpointing the exact coordinates of the missing energy flow. He confirmed the location as the Sol system. He fed the coordinates into the dreadnought's primary navigation systems. He engaged the massive dark matter thrusters, pushing the colossal bone ship out of its holding pattern. He directed the entire hive armada, consisting of thousands of heavy seed ships and massive tomb carriers, to break orbit and follow his trajectory. The fleet accelerated toward the physical space occupied by the blue planet and its cratered moon. The human vanguard detected the approach of the massive hive fleet as it entered the outer edges of the Sol system. They utilized deep space monitoring stations positioned near Saturn to track the incoming thermal signatures. They registered the sheer physical mass of the dreadnought and immediately deployed their awoken allies to intercept the armada. The awoken fleet, commanded by Queen Mara Sov, consisted of nimble fighter craft and heavily armored frigates. They positioned their ships within the icy rings of Saturn, hiding their heat signatures among the floating chunks of frozen water and rock. As the dreadnought pushed through the dense rings, crushing the ice into fine vapor, the awoken fleet launched their attack. They fired heavy plasma torpedoes and directed energy beams directly into the Hive escort ships. The kinetic impacts shattered the bone hulls of the seed ships, sending Hive knights and thralls tumbling out into the freezing vacuum of space. The awoken fighters darted between the massive Hive vessels, evading the returning fire from the dark matter artillery batteries. Queen Mara Sov stood on the bridge of her flagship, a sleek vessel constructed from advanced carbon composites. She wove a complex matrix of paracausal energy, using her own biological connection to the light and the darkness. She projected this energy outward, compressing the ambient space around the Hive fleet and generating hundreds of miniature gravitational singularities. These localized anomalies caught the Hive tomb ships, crushing their dense carapaces inward and collapsing the vessels into tight, compact spheres of crushed bone and green fluid. Oryx watched the destruction of his escort ships from the main viewport of the dreadnought. He identified the paracausal energy utilized by the awoken queen. He unhooked the tablets of ruin from his waist and engaged the core mechanism of the dreadnought. The massive bone ship possessed an internal weapon directly tied to the physical dimensions of his throne world. Oryx pushed the raw, physical reality of his ascendant realm outward, forcing the dark matter void to overlap directly with the physical space of the solar system. He expanded his localized physics into the surrounding vacuum. A colossal shockwave of cold white light erupted from the hull of the dreadnought. The wave expanded outward in a perfect sphere, moving at the speed of light. The physical force of the expanding throne world struck the awoken fleet, bypassing their metallic shielding completely. The white light washed over the frigates and the fighter craft, instantly disintegrating the carbon composites and vaporizing the biological tissue of the awoken pilots. The shockwave pushed through the icy rings of Saturn, clearing a massive, permanent hole in the debris field. The energy pulse continued outward, striking the surviving Hive ships caught in the blast radius and converting their physical mass into floating dust. The awoken fleet was decimated in a single, massive physical expansion of the deep. The dreadnought hovered in the center of the cleared ring, its bone hull radiating a faint, residual white glow. Oryx deactivated the localized expansion and rehooked the tablets of ruin to his chains. He established a stationary orbit over the rings of Saturn, securing his position within the outer edges of the system. He utilized his taken mechanism immediately, pulling the surviving commanders of the Cabal, the Vex, and the Fallen directly into the cold abyss of the Ascendant Realm, restructuring their physical forms into dark, compliant soldiers. He flooded the Sol system with these altered troops, directing them to sabotage the human defensive lines and clear the path to the Blue Planet. He possessed total tactical superiority and a clear route to the species responsible for destroying his sun. The Cabal Empire maintained a massive military presence within the Sol system. They established heavy firebase installations on the dusty red surface of Mars, constructing thick metal bunkers and deploying massive siege dancers equipped with high-yield rocket pods. The Skyburners Command Unit operated from a heavily armored orbital carrier, directly managing the logistics and heavy ordnance of the Martian offensive. They intercepted the telemetry data of the dreadnought's localized physical expansion and recognized the immediate threat posed by the towering bone ship hovering over Saturn's rings. Primus Tauan, the commander of the Skyburners, initiated a direct physical boarding action. He directed his massive orbital carrier toward the dreadnought. The Cabal carrier accelerated rapidly, overriding its own deceleration thrusters. The heavy metal hull slammed directly into the side of the massive bone ship, tearing a jagged hole through the outer chitin plating and embedding the nose of the carrier deep into the dark matter architecture of the dreadnought. Primus Tanun and his commanders, Valus Maul and Valus Tluurn, marched down the boarding ramp, carrying heavy slug rifles and wearing pressurized, multi-ton combat armor. They led thousands of heavily armed legionaries directly into the dark corridors of the Hive ship. The Cabal forces deployed heavy automated turrets and dense energy shields, securing a massive beachhead within the dreadnought's hull. They fired continuous barrages of high explosive rounds into the dark tunnels, vaporizing the thralls and shattering the knights that rushed their lines. Primus Taron recognized the paracausal nature of the Hive's regeneration. He ordered his commanders to push deep into the ship, aiming to locate the central engine or the command deck, intending to plant high-yield explosive charges and detonate the entire dreadnought from the inside out. Oryx monitored the Cabal incursion from his central navigation deck. He noted the sheer physical mass of the Cabal armor and the organized efficiency of their military tactics. He walked out of the command room and descended into the lower levels of his ship, carrying Willbreaker. He encountered Primus Ton and Valus Mauwal in a wide, cavernous chamber filled with suspended, glowing green fluid sacs. The Cabal commanders raised their heavy weapons and fired. The tungsten slugs sparked against the dark matter shielding surrounding Oryx. Oryx raised his clawed hand and opened a massive spatial tear behind the two commanders. The localized gravity pulled Primus Ta'an and Valus Mawul backward. Their heavy boots scraped against the metal decking as they were dragged into the cold abyss of the Ascendant Realm. The radiation flooded their pressurized suits immediately. The dark energy fused their armor directly to their biological tissue, turning the thick metal plates a shifting, light-absorbing black. The radiation optimized their physical mass, granting them the ability to project localized energy shields and fire bursts of blinding white light from their weapon mounts. Oryx pushed the two altered commanders back into the physical corridors of the dreadnought. The taken Cabal turned their modified weapons on the remaining legionaries, utilizing their newly acquired paracausal abilities to dismantle the Cabal beachhead from within. While the taken Cabal engaged their former allies, a human Guardian infiltrated the dreadnought. The Guardian utilized a cloaking field generator and a transmat beacon to bypass the ongoing firefight in the main corridors. This Guardian carried a heavy fusion rifle and wore combat armor, reinforced with dense, plasteel plating. The human operative navigated the complex, winding tunnels of the bone ship, tracking the high-concentration radiation signatures directly to the central command deck. The Guardian stepped into the vast open chamber and confronted Oryx directly. Oryx gripped Willbreaker and swung the heavy blade, projecting massive, sweeping arcs of dark energy across the room. The Guardian evaded the strikes, utilizing short-range teleportation bursts to close the distance. The Guardian fired a continuous stream of superheated fusion bolts directly into the central mass of Oryx's chest plating. The intense thermal energy burned through the dark matter shielding and cracked the dense bone armor underneath. Oryx stumbled backward, dropping his heavy cleaver onto the floor. Oryx analyzed the physical output of the human operative. He recognized the pure, undiluted power of the light, fueling the Guardian's weapons and movement. He calculated the structural failure of his own physical body. He reached down and gripped the hilt of his heavy blade. He channeled the remaining dark energy in his physical form, generating a localized spatial tear directly beneath his own feet. He allowed his massive, armored body to fall backward into the fissure. The tear sealed shut, extracting Oryx entirely from the physical universe and pulling him completely into the dark matter void of his throne world. The central command deck fell silent, leaving the Guardian standing over the cracked stone floor, holding the smoking fusion rifle. Oryx had retreated to his final, most fortified position, waiting for the Guardian to cross the dimensional threshold and face him within the absolute center of the Ascendant Realm. Oryx stood in the dead center of his throne world. The obsidian chamber was quiet. The cold white light radiating from his chest illuminated the massive iron braziers and the jagged pillars holding up the dark stone ceiling. He turned toward the massive dimensional tear, connecting his throne to the physical space of the dreadnought. He stepped onto the central platform, drawing his heavy sword, Willbreaker, from its sheath across his back. He stood fully armored, his wide bone wings folded tightly against his carapace, waiting for the human operative to cross the threshold. The Guardian stepped through the glowing white fissure. The heavy plasteel boots clicked against the obsidian floor. The Guardian carried the same heavy fusion rifle, its copper coils still radiating excess heat from the battle on the command deck. Oryx slammed the heavy metal hilt of his sword against the stone floor. The impact sent a visible wave of dark energy rolling across the platform. He opened his jaws and released a low, rumbling frequency that vibrated the oxygen molecules in the chamber. He demanded the Guardian submit to the sword logic, to prove physical superiority, or to be broken down into raw fuel for the deep. The Guardian fired immediately. The fusion rifle discharged a continuous, superheated beam of solar plasma directly at Oryx's face. Oryx raised his left arm, projecting a localized field of dark matter to deflect the beam. The plasma splashed against the shield, scorching the obsidian tiles and filling the air with thick, gray smoke. Oryx lunged forward through the smoke. He swung Willbreaker in a wide horizontal arc, aiming to sever the Guardian's torso. The Guardian engaged the short-range teleportation burst, disappearing from the blade's path and reappearing near the edge of the platform. Oryx adjusted his stance rapidly. He calculated the exact physical trajectory of the Guardian's movements. He reached out with his clawed hand and opened 4 small dimensional tears around the operative. 4 taken knights stepped out of the cold abyss, raising their modified weapons. They fired heavy bursts of white radiation at the Guardian. The Guardian dropped to a crouch, evading the crossfire. The Guardian swapped the fusion rifle for a heavy rocket launcher, lifting the thick metal tube onto their shoulder. They fired a high-yield explosive shell directly at the stone floor beneath the taken knights. The concussive blast shattered the dark chitin armor and sent the fragmented bodies tumbling into the dark matter chasm below the platform. Oryx charged the Guardian during the explosion. He closed the physical distance before the operative could reload the heavy weapon. He drove his heavy plated knee into the Guardian's chest armor. The dense plasteel cracked under the impact, sending the operative sliding across the smooth obsidian. The heavy rocket launcher skittered away, stopping near the edge of the central platform. Oryx raised Willbreaker high above his head with both hands, aiming the jagged point directly at the Guardian's helmet. The Guardian rolled to the side as the heavy blade struck the floor, burying the iron edge deep into the stone. The Guardian pulled a hand cannon from a magnetic holster on their hip and fired 3 rapid shots directly into the joints of Oryx's knee armor. The tungsten slugs shattered the brittle bone plating, leaking thick black fluid onto the deck. Oryx grunted, pulling his sword free from the stone and stepping back to redistribute his massive weight. The Guardian retrieved the fusion rifle and channeled a massive surge of light energy through the copper coils. The weapon hummed loudly, glowing with intense, blinding heat. The Guardian fired a concentrated, continuous beam directly into the center of Oryx's exposed chest plate, aiming for the cold white light radiating from his core. The solar plasma burned through the heavy bone, melting the dark matter shielding and igniting the thick, leathery tissue underneath. Oryx roared, his vocal cords vibrating the air violently. He swung Willbreaker blindly through the superheated gas, attempting to strike the operative. The Guardian maintained the beam, pushing the thermal energy deep into the hive god's chest cavity. The intense heat reached the massive, pale worm coiled around Oryx's organs. The parasite shrieked, secreting a final, massive dose of corrosive acid into Oryx's bloodstream. The entire biological structure of the Taken King began to break down. The cold white light flickered and died. The dark energy holding his physical form together dissipated, leaving only the charred, heavy bone armor. Oryx dropped his massive sword. He fell backward, his heavy body collapsing onto the obsidian floor. The physical laws of the Ascendant Realm registered the absolute termination of its creator. The dark matter walls of the chamber began to crumble, breaking into large chunks of black stone that floated aimlessly in the cold abyss. The remaining Taken forces inside the dreadnought froze in place, completely cut off from the neural network that commanded them. The Guardian stood over the ruined body of the Taken King. The fusion rifle clicked as the copper coils cooled down. The operative picked up the heavy, jagged length of Willbreaker from the floor. The Guardian turned away from the corpse and stepped back through the dimensional tear, returning to the physical universe and leaving the fractured remnants of the High War to dissolve entirely into the dark matter void. The extreme cold of the deep space vacuum rapidly dropped the temperature of the hive god's biological tissue. The dense muscle fibers froze solid, expanding and cracking the heavy chitin plates covering his chest and limbs. The calcified structure of Oryx's massive corpse drifted away from the edge of the fractured obsidian platform. The surrounding gravity well of the dreadnought released the heavy mass, pushing the frozen body outward into the solar system. The trajectory carried the colossal frame directly through the rings of Saturn. The heavy bone plating smashed through solid blocks of orbiting ice, fracturing the frozen water into microscopic crystalline dust. Furthermore, the gravitational pull of the neighboring moon, Titan, captured the drifting mass. The body accelerated rapidly toward the moon, plunging directly into the thick nitrogen and methane clouds surrounding the celestial body. The friction of atmospheric entry generated a sheath of superheated plasma around the corpse. The thermal energy scorched the outer layers of the carapace, turning the dark bone into blackened ash. Subsequently, the massive frame impacted the surface of the global methane ocean. The collision displaced thousands of tons of liquid methane, sending towering waves crashing outward across the surface. The heavy, calcified structure sank immediately. It descended past floating hydrocarbon bergs and deep water currents. The external fluid pressure increased exponentially with depth, compressing the frozen internal organs and crushing the brittle wing membranes against the spine. Ultimately, the body struck the rocky seafloor. The impact kicked up dense clouds of methane silt. The remains of the Taken King rested entirely submerged, pinned to the seabed by the crushing weight of the liquid environment. Back inside the dreadnought, the dark matter architecture shifted, causing the heavy bulkheads to grind against one another and emit loud, shrieking metallic vibrations. Eris Morn walked across the metal floorboards of the primary command deck. Her heavy leather boots crushed the scattered, crystalline shards of the shattered oversoul into fine powder. She approached the massive iron blade of Willbreaker. The heavy weapon remained embedded, deep within the cracked obsidian floor. Thick black fluid coated the jagged edges of the metal. Eris knelt on the stone and directed her 3 grafted green optic organs toward the hilt of the sword. The biological lenses registered a dense concentration of localized dark radiation emitting directly from the weapon's core. She placed her gloved hands on the cold, jagged iron of the crossguard and applied sustained kinetic leverage. She twisted the heavy metal casing until the structural pins snapped. She pulled the outer shell apart, exposing a sharp, glowing crystal seated within the metal housing. The crystal emitted a harsh, white glare. It transferred a low, rhythmic vibration directly into Eris's hands, matching the physical frequency of the deep. She produced a thick, lead-lined cylindrical container from her pack. She dropped the pulsing crystal into the heavy metal tube and slammed the thick iron latches shut. The lead shielding blocked the white light and contained the radiation entirely. Eris transported the cylinder back to the human stronghold on Earth. She arranged the glowing core on a heavy steel workbench inside her subterranean laboratory. The Guardian arrived shortly after, carrying a heavy canvas sack. The operative deposited 50 jagged calcified fragments onto the metal table. These fragments consisted of compressed bone and dark matter, manually extracted from the walls and enemies within the dreadnought. Eris ignited a high-temperature solar torch, projecting a stream of blue-hot plasma directly over the calcified pieces. The extreme thermal energy melted the dense bone down into a thick, dark, moldable resin. The laboratory filled with the thick scent of scorched calcium and ozone. Eris used heavy iron tongs to shape this dark resin around the central crystal. She fused the physical remains of the hive directly to the radiating core. She attached a long cylindrical metal barrel and integrated a mechanical firing trigger into the lower assembly. Furthermore, she wrapped the outer handle in strips of thick, cured leather, securing the entire apparatus with iron rivets. The completed assembly functioned as a heavy, paracausal ballistic weapon. Eris designated the firearm as the Touch of Malice. The physical mechanics of the weapon established a direct biological link with the user. When the Guardian gripped the leather handle and engaged the firing trigger, the central crystal penetrated the external armor magnetically. The core extracted microscopic volumes of biological tissue and blood directly from the Guardian's hands. The internal machinery converted this extracted biological matter into dense, highly volatile projectiles of dark energy. The weapon discharged the projectiles with a deafening, percussive crack. The dark energy tore through the heavy armor plating of enemy targets, delivering massive kinetic trauma and dispersing concentrated radiation into the surrounding air. Consequently, the concentrated radiation and kinetic force previously commanded by the Taken King continued to impact physical targets through the Guardian's trigger pulls. Simultaneously, the massive hive hierarchy registered the immediate cessation of upward energy flow. The Ascendant Hive commanders, stationed across the Dreadnought and the lunar tunnels, detected the total absence of dark energy funneling to the apex position. The physical conduits transferring tribute ceased operation. The towering knights and hovering wizards recognized the immediate physical necessity to claim the flow of dark energy. A massive knight named Alak Hul, clad in thick, spiked iron armor, gripped his heavy executioner's axe. He marched out of his designated holding cell, a light-deprived chamber known as the Sunless Cell, and struck down the smaller acolytes guarding the corridor. He severed their limbs and absorbed their dark energy to fuel his own physical expansion. Meanwhile, a Taken commander named Malok mobilized his localized broods. Malok possessed a mutated biological structure, heavily irradiated by the cold white light of the deep. He gathered localized pockets of dark radiation, funneling the energy directly into his own glowing chest cavity. The remaining hive forces across the system immediately fragmented into opposing, hostile broods. They swung their jagged cleavers and discharged their dark matter rifles at one another. They spilled thick green fluid across the metal decks of the bone ship, initiating a brutal, physical war of succession to establish a new ruler through raw kinetic dominance. Savathun recognized the sudden disruption in the flow of dark energy immediately. She operated from a heavily fortified command carrier, positioned near the outer heliopause of the system. She analyzed the incoming telemetry and confirmed the complete physical destruction of Oryx's biological form within his ascendant realm. The localized physical laws holding the dreadnought's command structure together fractured instantly. Savathun watched the massive hive fleet splinter. Hundreds of ascendant knights and wizards drove their respective tomb ships away from Saturn, tearing open localized hyperspace portals and jumping blindly into deep space to avoid the ensuing power struggle. Savathun did not move her carrier to secure the dreadnought. Instead, she calculated the vast strategic opening created by her brother's death. She utilized the taken Vex mind, Kuria, stored deep within her containment vaults. She initiated a direct hardware interface, physically connecting her elongated skull to the brass chassis of the Axis mind. She downloaded Kuria's complex computational algorithms, acquiring the exact geometric formulas required to simulate the paracausal radiation of the deep. Savathun instructed Kuria to model a new mechanism of tribute, a system that generated dark energy through the act of deception and cunning, bypassing the strict requirement for physical slaughter. She engaged her thrusters and pushed her carrier into the dark matter void, plotting a long, complex trajectory away from the Sol system. Simultaneously, Shivu Arath received the physical notification of Oryx's termination. She occupied a massive, hollowed-out moon orbiting a binary star system far outside the galactic arm. The sudden absence of the Taken King's massive physical mass sent a shockwave through her own ascendant realm. She grasped her massive warhammer and crushed the stone floor of her central chamber. She acknowledged the absolute finality of the sword logic. Oryx had failed to maintain his physical dominance, and therefore he deserved to be dismantled. Xivu Arath rallied her massive war moons. She ordered her commanders to increase their planetary bombardments, seeking to absorb the wandering hive broods scattered by the dreadnought's failure. She expanded her absolute dedication to physical war, determined to become the singular, massive shape at the end of the universe. In the Sol system, Eris Morn secured the heavy iron cylinder containing the touch of malice within the deepest vaults of the human stronghold. She sealed the heavy steel doors and engaged the biometric locks. She stood in the quiet corridor, analyzing the physical remnants of the hive conflict. The massive bone ship remained parked over the icy rings of Saturn, its dark matter architecture slowly decaying without the Taken King's gravity well to hold it together. The localized broods on the moon continued their isolated skirmishes, digging deeper into the limestone tunnels to hide from the human operatives. Eris pulled the tattered edges of her dark cloak tight across her shoulders. The immediate physical threat of the hive hierarchy had been dismantled, yet the dark radiation of the deep still pulsed through the cold vacuum of space, searching for a new host to channel its destructive geometry. And so, the reign of the Osmium King's eldest daughter concluded. Orash, the curious Krill who had stared at the 52 moons of Fundament, had transformed into Oryx, the long-thought, and finally into Oryx, the Taken King. He had bound his biological structure entirely to the physical mechanics of destruction, extending his lifespan by millions of years and crushing entire galactic civilizations beneath his bone-plated boots. He had established a massive, self-feeding engine of death, seeking to carve the universe into a perfect final shape. Ultimately, His complex paracausal systems and heavy ascendant armor failed against the precise kinetic application of light energy. His physical form lay frozen at the bottom of a methane ocean, while his legacy dissolved into the scattered, violent power struggles of his surviving siblings and fractured broods. The fire burns low now, the heat fading from the coals. The stories of the dark matter void and the crushing ocean of fundament are heavy things to carry, but they are necessary to understand the forces moving through the cold space above us. Rest now, let your light settle, and perhaps tomorrow the sky will remain clear. Hopefully, the road ahead will be kinder. Are you all set? Good. The massive bone hull of the dreadnought maintained a stationary orbit within the icy rings of Saturn. The localized dark matter architecture of the ship began to decay, shedding thick flakes of calcified plating into the surrounding vacuum. The taken forces scattered across the Sol system operated solely on basic survival directives. Heavy concentrations of dark radiation, known as taken blights, expanded rapidly across the planetary surfaces. These blights consisted of dense spheres of sterile white light surrounded by thick pools of black, tar-like fluid. The fluid seeped into the red sand of Mars and the sulfurous soil of Venus, solidifying the loose dirt into jagged obsidian glass. The blights pulsed with high-frequency radiation, actively restructuring the surrounding physical matter and waiting for a new central command structure to direct their expansion. Deep within the lowest, unlit levels of the dreadnought rested a massive vertical cylinder carved directly into the bone hull. Heavy iron doors, secured by thick, rusted metal chains, sealed the top of this chamber. This holding pen was designated the Sunless Cell. A towering hive knight named Alak-Hul waited at the bottom of the pitch-black pit. Alak-Hul wore ultra-dense, spiked iron armor and carried a massive, double-bladed executioner's axe. Oryx had forced Alak-Hul into this chamber centuries prior, following a violent territorial dispute. A loyal sect of hive wizards and acolytes moved through the dark corridors toward the cell. The wizards wove high-pitched acoustic frequencies in the damp air, vibrating the heavy iron chains until the metal links fractured and snapped. They intended to release the massive knight and physically elevate him to the apex position of the hive hierarchy. A fire team of human guardians registered the localized seismic vibrations generated by the breaking chains. The operatives descended through the dreadnought's ventilation shafts, dropping directly through the open iron doors and landing heavily on the stone floor of the Sunless Cell. The ambient light levels in the pit sat at absolute zero. The Guardians activated the high-intensity lumen lamps mounted on their heavy kinetic rifles, sweeping the narrow beams of white light across the jagged floorboards. Alak-Hul lunged from the shadows, swinging his massive executioner's axe in a wide, horizontal arc. The heavy metal blade struck the stone, sending sharp fragments of rock flying into the air and generating a massive kinetic shockwave. The Guardians utilized their localized teleportation drives, flashing across the chamber to establish a triangular firing formation. They discharged continuous bursts of superheated solar plasma from their heavy fusion rifles. The intense thermal energy struck Alak-Hul's chest, melting the thick iron spikes and burning through the dense chitin underneath. The massive knight collapsed onto the stone floor, his armored frame smoking and leaking thick black fluid, terminating his bid for the throne. Simultaneously, another biological entity moved to secure command of the scattered Taken forces. This creature, designated Malok, possessed a heavily mutated physical structure. Malok originated from Savathun's brood, But Oryx had subjected him to the geometric formulas of the deep, fusing dark radiation directly into his nervous system. Malok's skull consisted entirely of a bulbous, translucent sac pulsating with cold white light. He utilized this heavily irradiated neural network to transmit localized commands to the surrounding Taken blights. He traveled to the Hellmouth on the moon and entered the subterranean bone tunnels of the Shrine of Oryx. He intended to siphon the residual dark energy stored within the shrine's central conduits to mass-produce new Taken soldiers and overwhelm the human defensive lines on Earth. Malok stood in the center of the shrine, surrounded by towering, ribbed arches of yellow bone. He projected dense streams of white radiation from his elongated fingers, pulling captured fallen scavengers through small spatial tiers and forcibly restructuring their cellular biology. The human operatives tracked the massive radiation spikes directly to the lunar coordinates. They breached the central chamber, deploying high-yield arc grenades into the clustered ranks of the newly formed Taken soldiers. The electrical detonations shattered the dark matter shielding of the Taken forces, filling the cavern with the smell of ozone and burning synthetic ether. Malok raised his hands and fired dense, heavy spheres of volatile dark matter across the cavern. The spheres struck the limestone walls, melting the rock into glowing green slag and splashing acidic fluid across the Guardian's plasteel armor. The operatives dispersed, taking cover behind the thick bone pillars. They loaded high-caliber, armor-piercing tungsten rounds into their heavy machine guns. They concentrated their overlapping fields of fire entirely on the glowing, translucent sac forming Malok's head. The rapid succession of kinetic impacts tore through the thin outer membrane of his skull. The dense radiation contained inside the sac destabilized and detonated violently. The physical explosion shattered Malok's skeletal structure, throwing his severed limbs across the stone floor and pooling highly radioactive white fluid in the center of the shrine. The physical termination of Alak-Hul and Malok completely dismantled the immediate chain of succession within the Sol system. The massive hive broods operating on the moon and within the dreadnought fractured into isolated, self-serving factions. The lower-tier knights and acolytes hoarded the dark energy generated from their localized skirmishes, refusing to funnel the tribute upward. Their physical bodies reacted to the retained energy, expanding rapidly and developing thick, irregular bone growths across their carapaces. The localized hive threat diminished in scale, reducing their operations to defending their immediate subterranean territories. The dark matter void of the Ascendant Realm shifted around this massive disruption in the tithe, sending deep, low-frequency gravitational ripples outward through the physical universe, carrying the exact telemetry of the Taken King's destruction directly toward the distant, heavily fortified star systems occupied by Savathun and Sivu Arath. The physical dimension of the High War began to destabilize immediately following the Guardian's departure. The massive obsidian platforms suspended over the central chasm fractured, sending sharp shards of dark stone tumbling into the void below. The heavy iron braziers tipped over, spilling glowing liquid across the cracked floorboards. The glowing liquid melted the top layers of the stone, generating thick plumes of sulfurous smoke. The atmospheric pressure inside the throne world dropped rapidly, venting the thick scent of ozone and scorched chitin out into the surrounding vacuum. The structural integrity of the Ascendant Realm relied entirely on the massive kinetic force and constant tribute generated by the Taken King. The termination of his biological functions severed the primary load-bearing pillar of the dimension. A single small sphere of white light floated through the collapsing geometry of the chamber. This sphere contained the translated consciousness of Toland, the human warlock who had allowed the Death Singer to disintegrate his physical body. Toland navigated the shifting dark matter, darting between the falling debris and the leaking thermal vents. He approached the central platform, where the physical remains of Oryx's sword had rested. Toland hovered over the deep gouges cut into the obsidian floor. He observed the massive pool of residual dark energy radiating from the site of the execution. The rigid physical laws of the sword logic required a strict, linear transfer of mass and power. The organism that executed the king earned the physical right to occupy the apex position of the hierarchy. The executioner acquired the accumulated tribute, the command over the taken forces, and the absolute control over the physical dimensions of the throne world. Toland registered the untouched pool of radiation and the vacant obsidian seat at the center of the chamber. The human operative had rejected the central tenet of the deep. The Guardian had fired their weapon, destroyed the colossal biological frame of the king, and simply walked back through the spatial tear. They abandoned the raw materials of godhood, leaving the massive concentration of paracausal power to pool and stagnate on the cold stone. Toland vibrated his small, spherical form, emitting high-frequency acoustic waves that shattered the nearby glass fluid conduits. He possessed a complete mathematical understanding of the hive's physical systems, and he recognized the immediate structural danger of the vacant throne. The vast, surrounding expanse of the Ascendant Realm consisted of a volatile, high-pressure environment known as the Sea of Screams. This region contained raw, unshaped dark matter and highly corrosive radiation. The High War had previously acted as a fortified physical displacement within this sea, held open by Oryx's massive gravitational pull. The unoccupied throne caused the outer boundaries of the High War to thin and buckle. The Sea of Screams pressed inward, eroding the edges of the obsidian platforms and flooding the lower chambers with volatile, liquid matter. The surviving Ascendant Hive, located within the perimeter of the throne world, experienced rapid physical trauma. The towering knights and hovering wizards relied on the continuous upward flow of the tithe system to regulate the massive worms occupying their abdomens. The sudden termination of the apex recipient caused the flow of dark energy to back up entirely. The energy pooled in the lower tiers of the hierarchy. The parasites inside the Ascendant Hive absorbed this excess radiation rapidly. The segmented bodies of the worms stretched and thickened, pressing hard against the internal organs of their hosts. The parasites expanded beyond the physical capacity of the internal cavities. The heavy chitin plating of the knights cracked outward under the extreme pressure. Thick green fluid leaked from their joints as the overfed parasites burst through their rib cages, consuming the host tissue and spilling onto the fracturing stone floor. Toland navigated away from the bursting hive specimens, floating upward toward the crumbling ceiling of the chamber. He recorded the exact mathematical sequences of the collapsing dimension, storing the data within his luminous frame. The absolute physical dominance established by the Osmium King over millions of years dissolved into chaotic, localized kinetic events. The carefully structured broods devolved into disorganized swarms, fighting over the shrinking patches of stable ground. Toland drifted through a widening fissure in the dark matter roof, passing out of the specific boundaries of the High War and entering the chaotic, swirling currents of the Sea of Screams. He began a long, solitary transit across the Ascendant Realm, searching for the specific localized domains of the surviving hive gods to observe their physical adaptations to the resulting power vacuum. The physical space of the dreadnought in the material universe reflected this internal collapse. The massive bone hull hovering over Saturn's rings lost its localized gravitational shielding. The extreme temperatures of deep space began to freeze the biological tissue connecting the fossilized armor segments. Micrometeorites and ice fragments from the surrounding planetary rings impacted the hull directly, gouging deep craters into the dark chitin. The ship transitioned into a massive, drifting structure of dead matter. The dark tunnels and humid breeding pits cooled rapidly, forcing the surviving thralls and acolytes to burrow deep into the central thermal vents to maintain their core body temperatures. The grand physical architecture of the Taken King initiated a slow, inevitable process of physical decay. Simultaneously, the thousands of irradiated Taken soldiers deployed across the neighboring planets lost their central command signals. The dark matter fluid pooling inside their restructured armor began to boil and expand, prompting these altered creatures to initiate aimless, highly destructive physical patterns across the red sand of Mars and the dense jungles of Venus. I will provide you with part 28 shortly. This section requires me to adjust the narrative flow and focus on physical descriptions to stay true to the prompt's constraints. I will continue the story after the events in part 27. I will not personify abstract concepts or tell the listener how a space feels. I will be right back with the content. Please let me know if there are specific physical details or events you would like me to include in part 28. The spherical anomalies of white light and thick black fluid expanded across the red sand dunes of Mars and the dense, humid jungles of Venus. These localized radiation fields, designated as Taken blights, continued to restructure the surrounding baryonic matter according to the residual geometric formulas programmed by Oryx. The altered Cabal legionaries and Vex minotaurs patrolled the perimeters of these blights. They discharged heavy blasts of solar plasma and dark radiation at any approaching biological signatures. They operated entirely on automated survival directives, lacking the overarching paracausal network previously maintained by the Taken King. Human operatives flew jump ships across the inner solar system and landed directly inside these irradiated zones. A guardian dropped from a hovering ship onto the scorched Martian soil, gripping the leather-wrapped handle of the Touch of Malice. The guardian marched directly toward the center of a massive Taken blight. The surrounding black fluid boiled, and a towering winged figure materialized from the cold white light. This entity possessed the exact skeletal structure and dense chitin plating of Oryx, yet it lacked the immense physical mass and the core worm parasite of the original hive god. This construct operated as an echo, a localized physical copy generated from compressed dark matter and leftover radiation. The echo raised its heavy arms and projected localized gravitational tears across the sand. The Guardian bypassed the spatial anomalies, utilizing a short-range teleportation burst to cross the physical distance rapidly. The Guardian aimed the heavy barrel of the Touch of Malice directly at the echo's chest. The central crystal inside the weapon extracted a microscopic volume of the Guardian's blood, converting the biological fluid into a highly volatile projectile of concentrated dark energy. The Guardian pulled the mechanical trigger. The weapon discharged with a heavy kinetic recoil, sending the dark matter projectile tearing through the air. The blast struck the echo, fracturing the simulated bone armor and dispersing the compressed radiation into the surrounding atmosphere. The winged figure collapsed into a pile of drifting ash, and the thick black fluid of the blight evaporated instantly, leaving only smooth, crystallized red sand behind. The human forces repeated this specific kinetic engagement across hundreds of separate operational zones. They targeted the glowing blights on the rusted metal decks of abandoned cosmodrome facilities and within the damp, subterranean sinkholes of Venus. They utilized heavy fusion rifles, armor-piercing kinetic ammunition, and focused streams of light energy to shatter the dark matter shielding of the remaining Taken commanders. They systematically vaporized the altered alien soldiers, clearing the physical corridors and the planetary surfaces of the volatile white radiation. Eris Morn monitored these eradication efforts from her subterranean laboratory beneath the tower. She stood over a heavy steel table covered in highly detailed topographical maps and planetary telemetry readouts. She placed small, iron markers on the coordinates, where the Guardians confirmed the physical destruction of an echo or a Taken blight. The number of active radiation zones on the illuminated screens decreased steadily. She recorded the specific energy output of each destroyed echo, documenting the physical decay of the Taken King's paracausal network. She sorted the remaining fragments of calcified bone and dark matter brought back by the operatives, locking the volatile materials inside thick, lead-lined containment cylinders. The surviving hive broods residing in the limestone tunnels of the moon registered the systematic destruction of the Taken anomalies. The knights and acolytes belonging to the hidden swarm analyzed the rapid drop in ambient dark energy across the system. They observed the human operatives dismantling the final physical remnants of Oryx's invasion force. The hidden swarm commanders retreated deeper into the subterranean caverns, sealing the heavy iron doors and collapsing the upper tunnels with high-yield explosive charges. They barricaded themselves within the deepest breeding pits, surrounded by the towering ribbed arches of yellow bone. The localized commanders of the hidden swarm initiated a rapid physical reorganization of their broods. They directed the wizards to construct new obsidian altars and forge heavier, denser iron cleavers for the knights. The wizards hovered over the stone anvils, weaving high-frequency acoustic waves that vibrated the cooling metal, compressing the iron molecules to increase the physical density of the blades. The knights gathered the available thralls and forced them into the warm, green-lit pools of the breeding pits. They fed the smaller creatures specialized, highly concentrated biomatter harvested from the subterranean fungi. This diet accelerated their cellular mutation, expanding their skeletal structures and hardening their pale skin into thick, dark chitin. The hive fortified their subterranean perimeter extensively. The acolytes dragged massive blocks of crushed limestone and fused them together using superheated dark energy, creating thick blast walls across the primary access corridors. They embedded heavy particle cannons into the rock, aligning the targeting optics down the long, lightless tunnels. The brood hauled rock and hammered metal continuously. The parasites inside their abdomens writhed and secreted localized bursts of acid, physically driving the brood to prepare a new, massive flow of tribute. They required a massive volume of death and physical destruction to elevate a new commander to the apex position of their fragmented hierarchy. The hive sharpened their newly forged cleavers on heavy grinding stones. The continuous friction sent bright sparks flying across the damp caverns, filling the dark tunnels with the sharp scent of ozone and the loud, grating sound of scraping metal. They positioned their heavy, armored bodies behind the blast walls, waiting to push back against the human operatives and violently claim the vacant throne. The human vanguard deployed heavily armored jump ships to the icy rings of Saturn. The operatives exited the spacecraft and attached thick braided steel tethers to the jagged bone hull of the dreadnought. They constructed rigid plasteel monitoring stations along the exterior plating, securing the metal frames directly into the calcified chitin. The human technicians routed high-voltage cables from the stations into the deep internal corridors of the hive ship, powering arrays of bright lumen lamps. The white light illuminated the deep scratches and the pooling green fluid left behind by the fractured hive broods. The operatives swept the lower decks with heavy kinetic rifles, discharging armor-piercing rounds into the remaining acolytes and thralls. They gathered the scattered dark matter weapons, catalogued the geometric dimensions of the technology, and locked the objects inside dense lead crates. The physical perimeter around the colossal bone ship expanded rapidly. The operatives established a rigid blockade consisting of automated kinetic artillery and synchronized thermal sensors. They anchored the dreadnought to a fixed orbital path, subjecting the massive dark matter architecture to constant human surveillance. Simultaneously, the hive broods occupying the lunar tunnels executed extensive subterranean excavations. The knights swung heavy iron pickaxes, striking the limestone and expanding the lower caverns. They carried massive boulders of crushed rock and piled them across the upper access shafts. The wizards utilized high-frequency acoustic vibrations to melt the limestone, fusing the loose boulders into solid, thick barricades. The hive isolated their central breeding pits from the lunar surface completely. The thralls consumed thick fungal growths from the cavern floors, accumulating dense biomatter to accelerate their carapace development. The hive generated localized thermal energy by rubbing their chitinous limbs together, transferring the friction heat directly into the subterranean fluid pools. They focused their actions entirely on physical reproduction and structural fortification. They multiplied their ranks within the sealed limestone environment, building a dense concentration of kinetic force deep beneath the grey dust. Far beyond the outer boundaries of the Sol system, Savathun and Jivu Arath registered the permanent termination of the dark energy previously transmitted by their brother. Jivu Arath stood on the surface of a barren, rocky planetoid orbiting a dying red star. She raised her massive warhammer and struck the ground repeatedly. The heavy kinetic impacts shattered the planetary crust and sent massive seismic shockwaves traveling through the dense mantle. She directed her armored broods to board their massive bone-hulled ships. She commanded the fleet to navigate toward the densest concentrations of biological life located in the adjacent star systems. She relied strictly on the application of overwhelming physical force to extract tribute for the massive worm residing in her abdomen. Savathun operated from the bridge of her concealed command carrier. She analyzed the geometric telemetry of the localized gravitational folds produced by the taken axis mind, Korea. Savathun formulated a strategy utilizing misdirection and the direct manipulation of enemy communication frequencies. She deployed her vessels into the dense asteroid belts, positioning their thermal signatures behind massive chunks of frozen water and rock. She plotted a long, calculated trajectory toward the Sol system. She monitored the human operatives from a massive physical distance, gathering complex visual data on their patrol routes and their defensive installations. She fed the geometric coordinates of the human stronghold directly into her navigation arrays, setting the physical course for her eventual arrival. The frozen, calcified remains of the taken king rested on the dark, rocky seafloor of Titan. The thick liquid methane exerted massive, continuous physical pressure against the shattered carapace. Microscopic organisms, native to the methane ocean, attached themselves to the bone plating. They secreted highly acidic enzymes that dissolved the hardened chitin slowly, extracting the residual calcium and carbon to fuel their own cellular reproduction. The massive skeletal frame sank deeper into the loose silt, integrating into the physical sediment of the moon. The human operatives retained the heavy iron blade of Willbreaker. Eris Morn kept the heavy lead cylinder, containing the touch of malice, locked inside the subterranean vaults beneath the tower. The dense crystal inside the weapon emitted a low, continuous rhythmic vibration. The kinetic energy transferred through the heavy lead casing and vibrated the solid steel table constantly. The physical components of the hive god persisted in these fragmented states, compartmentalized and contained entirely by the human forces. The physical equilibrium of the Sol system stabilized under the watch of the Vanguard. The human operatives maintained their atmospheric patrols, scanning the orbital pathways with high-resolution thermal sensors. The massive white sphere of the Traveler remained suspended in the atmosphere above the Earth, projecting its dense, localized gravity field over the last city. The coals in the fire pit emit a dull red glow, radiating a low level of thermal heat across the stone floor of the tower. The spoken account, detailing the physical expansion and the ultimate destruction of the Osmium King's eldest daughter, concludes here. The physical universe continues to operate according to strict kinetic laws and the constant exchange of material energy. Your biological systems require a period of lowered kinetic output to repair muscle fibers and consolidate neural pathways. You can rest your physical frame on the bench and lower your optical receptors. The surrounding stone walls provide a rigid barrier against the wind, and the Vanguard radar arrays monitor the airspace above the city continuously. I will remain by the fire pit and tend the coals. I hope you found this account informative. Rest your body, and we will converse again during your next rotation.